It's been short and good. For members participating remotely, the members experiencing connectivity technical problems, please inform the committee staff as soon as possible when you receive assistance. I'll make a good faith effort to provide any member experiencing connectivity issues an opportunity to participate fully in the proceedings. It's the responsibility of each member seeking recognition. Unmute their microphone prior to speaking. Keep their microphone muted when not speaking and avoid inadvertent background noise. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I will yell at you. And finally, to insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. Wow, you did shorten it. That's good. Thank you. Today's hearing is an important step on the path to a more sustainable transportation future. The depth of interest in this hearing, which resulted in 8 witnesses today, demonstrates the willingness and readiness of corporate America to be active partners in solving the monumental challenges we face regarding infrastructure and climate change. As we will hear today, both private sector action and sound public policy are necessary to meaningfully address climate change. This is not about whether we need either private voluntary reductions or government measures. We need both. We will need commitment at all levels of government, from the private sector to achieve significant reductions in carbon pollution, transportation sector, transition to large-scale decarbonization, and to invest in the infrastructure upgrades to make our assets and facilities resilient to extreme weather events and sea level rise. Further, to protect assets and to invest in emissions reductions will have real financial consequences to business and transportation agencies, both now and in the long run. We'll hear those messages loud and clear today. In 2021, we have thankfully moved beyond the polarizing discussion of whether we need to act, which has stalled progress on an existential threat to our planet and our citizens for far too long. If any are here today to make that argument, I urge you to review the prepared remarks of our panel. Every one of the business leaders here today can confirm the denial of this reality is a bad business decision. But these decisions are about more than just the bottom line. We'll hear from our panel today that the transportation sector in particular holds tremendous promise for new norms that will move the needle on climate change. To quote from Mr. Smith's written testimony, "We believe that a connected world is a better world, and we recognize that with the privilege of connecting the world also comes the responsibility of being good stewards of the planet." While some sectors have begun to move in the right direction on climate, the same is not true in majority of the transportation sector, which is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Over the last 3 decades, those emissions have risen 24%, more than any other sector. Passenger and freight vehicles account for 82% of transportation sector emissions, which is why so much of this hearing will focus on surface transportation policy. The contribution to the carbon pollution problem from the way we currently move people and goods is clear. The available solutions are equally plentiful and promising. Conversion of personal vehicles, transit buses, trucks, locomotives to low and zero emission forms of power, providing alternative charging and fueling infrastructure, a rapidly expanding area that several witnesses will discuss today. Support of this transition through robust federal investment was a key element of the bill this committee approved in the last Congress as part of H.R. 2. Boosting investment in low and zero emission and more efficient modes of transportation, including transit, freight, passenger rail, walking, biking, is an equally important mitigation strategy, and we have several witnesses who actively work on projects to expand modal choice. H.R. 2 substantially increased investment in each of these modes while enhancing the safety of these options. Improved operational practices to reduce idling and traffic congestion will also help make better use of the infrastructure we have. That is smart use of our infrastructure, where we can get more throughput without having to add lane miles. And innovation within the construction sector to reduce or trap emissions produced through a life cycle of transportation project holds significant promise. H.R. 2 focuses heavily on the development and implementation of these technologies and practices. Each of these ideas taken together can add up to a substantial difference in mitigating the effects of climate change. Yet we know that we need to adapt is very real right now. Strengthening the ability to anticipate, withstand, and recover from natural disasters and extreme weather is a major portion of the U.S. response to the ongoing impacts of climate change. We'll hear case examples from witnesses today about how these investments are no longer optional, but a necessity, and that the reality is impacting the way we build and rebuild transportation assets. Climate's changing rapidly. Time is not on our side. This committee intends to take bold steps, again, this Congress, to support significant emissions reductions from the transportation sector, and support for action among the business community is growing. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently issued updated policy that states durable climate policy must be made by Congress. At this time, I'll insert into the record a letter from Chamber President Suzanne Clark, submitted for this hearing in support of addressing climate change. Without objection, so ordered. I thank each of our witnesses for being here today and persevering through what I know may be a long hearing. I know your time is valuable. The committee is grateful for your participation, and the time we invest in discussion today, however, is nothing compared to the time on earth we stand to pervert if we get this right. So again, thanks to all, and I will note that Mr. Smith has noted that he can only be here for 2 hours. Hopefully the other witnesses can stay. I expect we may go a little bit longer than that. With that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we can all agree that we want clean air and clean water for our communities, and that we have to prepare for the challenges that are posed by severe weather events and those that are happening with greater frequency and intensity. And while climate change is often considered to be a loaded issue that sends us all to our respective partisan corners, I can tell you that protecting the environment is very much a bipartisan issue. We have leaders on this committee who've been working hard to address the issue, and this committee has a bipartisan track record of addressing issues like resiliency and mitigation, which prepares our infrastructure to withstand the impacts of climate change. We're willing to work with our Democrat colleagues on goals of reducing emissions in transportation. However, my colleagues must also understand that people are not going to stop driving cars or flying on airplanes. While dramatically increasing funding for transit and passenger rail, as proposed in last year's H.R. 2, it's going to take some cars off of the road in urban centers, but it's often inefficient and very much unjustified in rural America. Meanwhile, there are a couple of key points that help keep things in perspective. America is the world leader in reducing emissions, and according to the International Energy Agency, U.S. emissions reductions in the last 10 years have been the largest in world history. Plus, goods manufactured in the U.S. now are 80% more carbon efficient than the world average. There are a lot of innovative American companies that are coming up with some great solutions to reduce our emissions. It's important, as we hear from our witnesses today about the solutions that they have developed on their own, that Congress doesn't trample on the progress that they're making. What works for larger companies may not work for smaller companies, and larger companies have the resources to be able to deploy. The way to lead the world in becoming greener and more resilient is not through unachievable, one-size-fits-all policies or spending trillions on a patchwork of pilot programs. Heavy-handed mandates are only going to waste money and constrain innovation and put many of our job creators out of business. Instead, incentives that spur American innovation and accelerate what is already being done are the key to achieving our climate goals without taking down the economy and regulate jobs simply out of existence. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today on the unique ways in which each of them is working to find a viable long-term solution to reducing carbon use and growing American businesses. And with that, I would like to yield my remaining time to the ranking member on the Select Committee on Climate, Mr. Graves.
Thank Ranking Member Graves for the yield. Mr. Chairman, I just want to follow up quickly on the conversation that Ranking Member noted and also in your comments. Mr. Chairman, as we move forward, we've got to keep in mind that, number one, that this committee has jurisdiction over transportation infrastructure, and that, like the following up on the successful work of the FAST Act and other bills we've done in the past, we need to continue to advance our transportation solutions, and we need to do it in an efficient way because there's no question that we are decades behind where we need to be in regard to infrastructure progress, and it is impacting our economy. It is squeezing our economy. Mr. Chairman, as we move forward, we also need to keep in mind that the United States has reduced emissions more than the next 12 emissions-reducing countries combined in regard to emissions reductions in the energy sector. We are the global leader today in reducing emissions. And we've done that not through regulation, not through requirements, not through picking winners and losers in technology, but by letting the markets do what they do. As a matter of fact, when President Obama put the Clean Power Plan together, his objective was to reduce emissions by 32% off of a 2005 baseline. And the goal was, that President Obama set, was to do that by 2030. And Mr. Chairman, without the impact of regulations, without the impact of mandates, without the impact of picking winners and losers, we actually hit that target nearly 11 years earlier under President Trump, and we hit it in 2019, proving once again that we can move forward with affordable solutions, with clean solutions, with solutions that are based on U.S. resources and U.S. technology that are exportable, as opposed to picking winners and losers and moving in a direction where we subject ourselves to the manufacturing and production capabilities of China and other countries that don't share our objectives. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with everyone on this committee to build upon the successes and the lessons learned that we've had in the energy sector in reducing emissions, and make sure that we have a transportation bill with some clean energy solutions, not a climate change bill with transportation afterthoughts. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I got two letters. If I could get unanimous consent to insert them in the record from the American Cement Manufacturers and the American Public Gas Association.
Without objection, so ordered. We'll now proceed to our witnesses. Mr. Jack Allen, Chief Executive Officer, Proterra, Inc. Mr. Shamir Konar, Chief Executive Officer, Pilot Flying J, on behalf of the National Association of Truck Stop Operators. Mr. Troy Rudd, Chief Executive Officer, AECOM. Mr. Rafael Santana, President and Chief Executive Officer, WebTech. And Mr. Frederick Smith, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Express Corporation. Ms. Lori Giamona, Senior Vice President for Customer Care, Pacific Gas and Electric. Mr. Tom Lewis, National Business Line Executive for Climate Resilience and Sustainability, WSP USA. And Mr. Charles Hernick, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy, Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. As I said, this is a long witness list, but I appreciate your all being here. And if you would, we have your written remarks. If you would all summarize in a 5-minute statement, that would be most desirable. With that, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and the members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on the business case for climate solutions. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and this committee for driving the federal surface transportation policies and funding levels that will position America to compete and lead the future of transportation globally. The advancements and overarching focus on reducing emissions throughout H.R. 2 are exactly the bold steps that climate change and the opportunity for jobs and new industries demand. I am here today representing Proterra, Inc., an American electric vehicle technology company. Proterra has been delivering battery electric transit buses to U.S. transit agencies since 2010. Our buses have delivered over 17 million miles of service, and we serve communities in over 40 states in the District of Columbia. We have over 130 customers, including municipal transit agencies, airports, universities, and commercial businesses. Proterra is also a leader in the design and manufacturing of battery systems and electric drivetrains for commercial vehicles, and we provide charging infrastructure solutions for agencies and fleets. Our charging solutions enable bi-directional vehicle-to-grid applications, allowing electric vehicles to be strategic assets for the power grid. We provide our products and our services to other vehicle manufacturers, and our technology will be powering coach buses, school buses, delivery trucks, low-floor shuttles, and construction equipment in the United States and globally, in collaboration with some of the biggest names in the industry. Most importantly, we're an American company, an American technology leader. Our products are designed, engineered, and manufactured at our factories in the United States. We hold over 70 patents. We employ over 600 people across the nation, and we operate 3 U.S. factories. Our products comply with Made in America policies, and our businesses support hundreds of other U.S. businesses, including small businesses. Over 75% of the components in Proterra vehicles are sourced from American companies in more than 30 states, including Illinois, Minnesota, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Texas. As battery costs continue to decline and vehicle ranges increase, transitioning to zero-emission electric vehicles is not just the right thing to do for public health and to lower emissions, it's the smart thing to do for businesses. Compared to just 4 miles per gallon in diesel vehicles, Proterra vehicles have a fuel economy of 25 miles per gallon equivalent and a low total cost of ownership compared to diesel or natural gas vehicles. In addition, heavy-duty electric vehicle battery systems like Proterra's, we create economies and business opportunities well beyond transportation of goods and services. We have designed our battery systems to serve the development of multiple industries and applications. Our battery systems are built to last. They carry 6 to 12-year warranties. And after that, they still have the capacity for second life applications such as stationary energy storage. And beyond that, our batteries are designed for easy separation of components and are recyclable. The United States is positioned to lead the world in this emerging market for clean energy and clean mobility. This opportunity for U.S. leadership and manufacturing expansion is worthy of strong support from the federal government. The federal government, including the work of this committee, has already played a critical role in the early adoption of electric vehicle technology, and we ask that you continue to do so. Public transit funding through the FAST Act's low and no emissions program, for example, has accelerated our technology development to support the demand from U.S. transit agencies' investments in battery electric buses. By driving greater investment into the market, the federal government can send a strong signal to the industry and to the supply chains that the United States is committed to electrification, strengthening domestic supply chain for manufacturing and materials that will lower costs through economies of scale while creating even more American jobs in this rapidly growing global market. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Representative Burchett would like to briefly introduce the next witness.
I caught that briefly, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, today I have the honor of introducing Shamik Konar from Pilot Flying J. He's the Chief Executive Officer, and I noted that Congressman Cohen has someone from Tennessee as well, Mr. Smith, and I remember meeting him at Jimmy Kelly's in Nashville, Tennessee, within Senator Cohen, so I'm interested to hear his testimony as well. But today I'm honored to welcome Mr. Konar to our hearing. Since 2017, Mr. Konar has been instrumental in growing Pilot's energy business. Founded in 1958 by Jim Haslam in Knoxville, Tennessee, Pilot Flying J is now the 10th largest privately held company in the United States. And on a personal note, Mr. Haslam he's been a good friend to me. I saw him Saturday at our little coffee club we have at one of his pilots, and we were practicing social distancing, if anybody's listening to this. But Mr. Haslam has always been very benevolent to the community, literally giving millions and millions of dollars to the community. I saw just in today's press that his family had given another $1 million to the University of Tennessee. But on a personal note, when I was a young state legislator, I went back to my my elementary school, and I asked the principal if there was anything any of the kids needed, and she said, yeah, there was one kid that needed a jacket, and he was poor. I was pulling down about $16,500 a year, and I figured I could afford about half that jacket. So I called Big Jim Haslam on the phone, and he said, as he calls me Timmy, because he's known me since I was a little boy, and he said, Timmy, just come on by and pick up the check. But he said one thing, and we went half on that jacket, I remember, and the kid got to go home that day warm. And I remembered one thing he said. He said, "Just don't tell anybody, Tim. Just keep it anonymous." And I've honored that until this point right now, but it's been several years. So I feel it's important that we point out that these folks have a very huge impact on our local community. But back to Pilot, it's also the largest operator of travel centers in North America, with over 900 retail and fueling locations in 44 states, employing more than 28,000 team members. Pilot's success is emblematic of the American energy sector. Pilot and other businesses like it have chosen to make great strides on environmental issues. Because of private sector innovation, the United States is working towards significant emissions reduction, and I hope Pilot Flying J continues its good work. And I will note, Mr. Haslam has his autobiography out now, and he was started basically in one little station across the border in, I believe, Bristol, Virginia, and now its impact is literally nationwide. Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter in support of this testimony from the National Association of Convenience Stores and the Society of Independent Gasoline Marketers of America.
Without objection so ordered, Mr. Kanar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
For the very generous introduction. Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Shamik Konar. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Pilot Flying J, which is the largest travel center network in the United States. I'm testifying on behalf of NATSO, the National Association of Truck Stop Operators. Today, I hope to demonstrate to you that travel center companies and the broader retail fuel industry are invaluable partners as you seek to minimize the transportation sector's carbon footprint. Our industry has demonstrated that we are prepared to invest in any transportation fueling technology that our customers desire. We're eager to continue playing this important role as we transition to the next generation of transportation energy. The Biden administration wants to add 500,000 EV charging stations over the next decade. My testimony will focus on the most efficient, economical way to accomplish this objective and lower the carbon footprint of transportation fuel. We will need a partnership. We'll need a partnership between utilities and fuel retailers with support from the federal government to achieve this. In order to develop policies that facilitate this partnership, there are fundamentally two buckets of activities that we need to pursue. First, the power grid needs to be restructured. As EV charging stations are installed, generation, transmission, and distribution networks will need to be expanded to meet this new demand. Drivers must be assured that they will be able to refuel as reliably as they do today in order to expedite adoption of EVs. Second, the market dynamics that govern our industry today should be replicated to accommodate EVs. This will ensure that customers have multiple recharging options that are competing for their business on price, on speed of service, and on quality of service. As it relates to reducing range anxiety, one of the primary impediments to EV adoption is a nationwide network of fast charging stations. We believe that this is achievable, but there must be a policy framework to harness our core competencies of the utilities as well as the retail fuel sectors to make this work. The utility sector is best suited to perform the generation development and power grid restructuring work that will be essential to facilitate this network. The fuel retailers, on the other hand, like us, are best positioned to own and operate EV charging stations and provide transportation energy to customers along with services in a manner that they're accustomed to today. Until the number of EVs on the road reaches a critical mass, however, there is an important role for federal policy to bridge this gap and make private investments more viable while providing long-term consumer benefits and a reduction in the carbon emission footprint of the sector. These policies should encourage utilities and fuel retailers to focus activities where we are the most productive. At the same time, policies that may appear to be quick and easy solutions often undermine our objective, either utilities' incentives to restructure the power grid or the retailer's incentive to invest in charging infrastructure. For example, some electric utilities have had to increase costs to all ratepayers to underwrite their investment in EV charging stations and the electricity that powers EVs. Businesses like ours, businesses like mine, cannot do this, and we cannot compete in this environment with those who do. But this would make it very difficult for us to invest and actually hamper our goal of reducing the carbon footprint. Some advocates are also interested in allowing EV charging at interstate rest areas. This will discourage, again, companies like mine and other retailers in this industry from investing in charging infrastructure. It will also signal to prospective drivers that when they recharge, they will not have access to all of the amenities and the security they've come to expect from this sector. Approaches like these would undermine the business case for companies like Pilot and other fuel retailers to leverage our existing investments, and we have tens of billions of dollars invested in this sector, to develop EV charging infrastructure. As I've said, there's a very strong business case for us to be actively engaged in this space. It is our sincere hope that we can continue working with you, your staff, and my fellow witnesses to do just that. On behalf of NATSO and Pilot, I thank you for inviting me to testify here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you or the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Khanna. Mr. Troy Rudd.
Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Again, my name is Troy Rudd, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of AECOM. Our 47,000 professionals, including 19,000 U.S. employees, deliver vital infrastructure projects worldwide that are designed to uplift our communities, advance economic growth, and improve health, safety, and overall quality of life. We are ranked #1 globally for transportation engineering and design and environmental services. Drawing on our experience working on all continents and as proud partner of the federal government, state and local government agencies, and the private sector in the U.S., we hope to be a resource to the committee on these topics. And we thank you for the important work that you are doing. The business case for climate solutions in transportation is predicated on delivering the following outcomes, we believe, for all Americans: creating jobs, and more importantly, lasting careers, accelerating innovation and mobility to meet the needs of the future, enhancing the quality of life and the environment by reducing emissions, ensuring infrastructure resiliency, and stimulating economic growth that drives continued prosperity. In my testimony, I'd like to focus on 3 areas where government leadership can help achieve the outcomes I've described. First is advancing electrification. AECOM has guided more than 20 public agencies and many private sector clients with early adoption of electrification. In Los Angeles, for the Department of Transportation, we are delivering infrastructure to support full fleet conversion to battery electric buses. In other cities, we've studied the impacts of electrification on the grid, how transit agencies can best convert to electric, and how they can leverage battery storage of EVs even during grid outages. These projects have demonstrated numerous benefits in terms of emission reductions, especially in areas of vulnerable populations, job creation, and resiliency. We believe the federal government can play an important leadership role in accelerating electrification efforts by supporting the deployment of a reliable, accessible national electric charging network in 4 ways. Working with the private sector in setting design standards to encourage interoperability of charging infrastructure, prioritizing pilot projects to convert large state, municipal, and private sector fleets, investing in other charging innovations, including dynamic charging embedded in roads and freeways, and enhancing the use of electric vehicles by electrifying the U.S. Postal Service fleet and deploying regional and rural charging infrastructure. Second is building resilient infrastructure. Pursuing more resilient infrastructure is an important area of concern for our clients and where government can make a significant impact. In 2020 alone, the U.S. Faced 22 natural disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion each, the highest number ever in a single year, and the sixth consecutive with 10 or more billion-dollar events. We've conducted transportation climate risk analysis for clients like BNSF Railway, the San Francisco Bay Area Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the New York Economic Development Corporation, and many more, all looking at risk reduction strategies for climate events. These analyses find that potential losses due to natural disaster disruption can be offset by smaller adaptation investments today. AECOM supports reauthorization reforms that incentivize project investments that take into account environmental, social, and safety benefits beyond traditional life cycle costs, and criteria that prioritizes new investment decisions with long-term preservation and performance of the assets in mind. Third is unlocking innovation. We also need government to act boldly in support of new modes of mobility. In our recent fiscal year, AECOM worked on more than 29,000 projects for transportation clients in the United States. We found that projects which include more innovation are often delayed by rigid commercial models, dated standards, and jurisdictional conflicts. Visionary ideas in mobility, such as high-speed rail, Hyperloop, and more recently, electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, or flying taxis, can all play a role in improved mobility, congestion management, emissions reduction, and new economic output. For us, the bottom line is this: to promote innovative modes of transportation, we need to remove some of the obstacles that prevent investment and thinking beyond the status quo. In summary, pursuing climate solutions that advance electrification, build resilient infrastructure, and unlock innovation can yield significant benefits. What's more, it plays to American ingenuity and a bipartisan spirit in supporting transportation infrastructure that keeps our country moving forward. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Mr. Rafael Santana.
Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and committee members, I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the business case for climate solutions. This is an important topic for the future of the rail industry and the future of our nation. My name is Rafael Santana. I'm the president and CEO of Wabtec Corporation, a global leader in rail technologies for over 150 years. We're based in Pittsburgh. Wabtec has over 27,000 employees in more than 50 countries. We are the largest freight locomotive manufacturer. We move more than 20% of the world's freight, and we are a proud American company at the forefront of freight rail innovation. Wabtec embraces Congress' commitment to clean energy and the creation of jobs. We believe the freight rail sector is in a unique position to accelerate this effort, and Wabtec is prepared to contribute its resources to help meet the clean energy challenge. In that regard, I want to introduce you to a bold vision for transforming the future of freight rail known as Freight 2030. This is a public-private partnership that will accelerate our nation towards a better and a cleaner tomorrow. Joining Wabtec in this vision, we have Carnegie Mellon University, the nation's leading university in artificial intelligence and robotics, and we have Genesee, Wyoming, the nation's largest short line and regional freight railroad. Rail is without question the most sustainable, the safest, and the most efficient way to move both people and goods overland. But we can't stop there. At Wabtec, we innovate, we help our customers leverage rail to increase efficiency, to reduce costs, and to reduce their carbon footprint. A great example is Trip Optimizer. This is a cruise control technology for trains that has saved over 400 million gallons of fuel and has reduced CO2 by 500,000 tons per year. Wabtec is also leading the way toward clean freight with the world's first heavy haul, 100% battery electric locomotive. This is called FlexDrive. This locomotive is being tested in California with BNSF and with California Air Resources Board. We're also leading the way in rail and safety and utilization, having implemented positive train control systems with both Class 1 railroads and also with short lines. This is a safety overlay that covers all mainline track in the US. Wabtec strongly believes that by increasing capacity and better utilizing our world-class freight rail network, coupled with developing zero-emission locomotives, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 120 million tons per year. We can also create up to 250,000 jobs. For context, 120 million tons of greenhouse gases and of 26 million passenger cars. The time for rail is now, and Freight 2030 is a critical path to our nation's continued success. At the heart of Freight 2030, we have three core principles. The first one is decarbonization, and we're going to get there through zero-emission battery and hydrogen hybrid locomotives. Second piece is technology. We're going to use technology that will increase freight rail utilization and will improve safety. Third is the creation of direct, indirect, and induced jobs, roughly 80% of which will be blue-collar jobs. This vision would also enable better data sharing and increased visibility to the movement of goods from port to rail to yard. We propose to create the Freight Rail Innovation Institute at Carnegie Mellon, the first of its kind, to drive action towards significantly increasing freight rail utilization, decarbonization, while spurring jobs and economic growth. This institute will allow the US to lead ahead of others, including China, including Europe, in zero-emission solutions for rail, as well as become an exporter for the world. Wabtec and our partners, we're prepared to invest in the Freight Rail Innovation Institute alongside the US government and ask for your support in creating a clean energy future. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Santana. Now recognize Representative Cohen, who would like to briefly introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. Memphis is kind of a one-name town. There's Elvis, there's Sybil, and there's Fred. He's been responsible for so much in Memphis, and it wouldn't be the great 20th century city without him. And his employees have done a great job in delivering the vaccine to America and making us safer from this pandemic. FedEx has been the #1 carrier, along with UPS, I guess it's maybe a tie there, for helping get that vaccine to people around the country. There's not a cultural institution or athletic group that doesn't have a FedEx employee involved in a major way. The employees at FedEx contribute to our community in a phenomenal fashion. And FedEx is ahead of the game in every single area. Just as it was ahead of the game in bringing air cargo business as it has to the world, it's been ahead in climate and innovative activities with electric vehicles and forward thinking. Just this past week, FedEx became one of 50 countries to sign the Climate Challenge to reduce and have zero net carbon emissions by 2040, 10 years ahead of the Paris Accords. It's my honor to represent the city that FedEx has made a great city in America, Mr. Fred Smith.
Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on the business case for climate solutions. I'd like to also thank Congressman Cohen for that kind introduction. He represents Tennessee's 9th District, home of FedEx's headquarters, where we have over 30,000 team members employed. Addressing climate change is bigger than one business, and this committee recognizes for the United States to remain a global economic leader, we must work together on sound policy and innovative solutions for our planet. The health of our planet is at stake. FedEx has a long history of keeping sustainability at the center of our business, and we know the future of our operations is tied to the future of our environment. Building on that long-standing commitment, earlier this month, as Congressman Cohen mentioned, FedEx announced an enterprise-wide ambitious new goal to achieve carbon neutral operations by 2040. As part of this mission, we'll accelerate progress already underway in the following areas: electrification of our global parcel pickup and delivery vehicle fleet, sustainable customer solutions, sustainable fuels, modernization of our aircraft, and continuing fuel conservation endeavors. Alongside the many key steps outlined in my written testimony, by 2040, the entire FedEx parcel pickup and delivery fleet will be zero emissions electric vehicles. FedEx has also announced substantial support to help establish the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture to accelerate research into methods of carbon sequestration at scale. The center's first focus will be helping to develop strategies that offset greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to current emissions produced by aircraft. From there, the Yale Center will address additional global sources of emissions, publishing its findings so other businesses, industries, and governments can benefit. In addition to our work with Yale, FedEx has a number of other future-focused sustainability strategies underway. Roxo, the all-electric same-day bot, and our drone delivery pilot program operated by Wing Aviation are just two of the innovative, environmentally friendly, same-day last-mile delivery solutions we're working on. As seen during the pandemic, the U.S. trucking industry is a critical link in maintaining supply chains, yet remains stuck with aging infrastructure and dated federal equipment standards for twin 28-foot trailers unchanged since 1982. One step with immediate environmental benefits would be a modest 5-foot increase to twin 28-foot trailers, which would reduce annual fuel use by 225 million gallons per year at no cost to road safety or to the taxpayers. Last year, this committee and this chamber drafted an infrastructure package that incorporated important climate solutions. This included incentivizing commercial electric vehicles and zero-emission vehicle charging infrastructure, as well as advancing research into low emissions and alternative aviation fuel. There was also significant work done to modernize the electric grid for more renewable energy and prepare it for the large-scale deployment of electric vehicles. This is a good start indeed, but more needs to be done, including modernizing our air traffic control system and updating air traffic management policies and guidance. Our ambitious agenda at FedEx shows that businesses can and will lead in creating a sustainable future for us all. Our company has been at this for a very long time, however, and we cannot do it alone. Government, industry stakeholders, and academia must continue to work together on policies and regulations to help ensure the U.S. maintains its status as a global leader in climate change policy, while also stimulating economic growth and job development. These are just a few of the priorities we must focus on to address our global climate challenges. I look forward to discussing those shared goals with you today. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We now move to Ms. Lori Gimona. Ms. Gimona?
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves, for the opportunity to testify. I am Lori Giamona, Senior Vice President of Customer Care for Pacific Gas and Electric Company in California. I appreciate the committee's interest in how business plays a role in addressing climate change and commend the committee for examining ways that federal policy can complement this activity. PG&E's commitment to mitigating and adapting to climate change in a way that leaves no one behind is as strong as ever and fundamental to delivering on the triple bottom line: people, planet, and prosperity, underscored by strong operational performance. California has some of the nation's most ambitious climate and clean energy goals, including reaching carbon neutrality by 2045. PG&E is proud to be a committed partner in implementation of the state's vision. We provide some of the cleanest energy in the nation, with 88% of electricity delivered from carbon-free sources. We are focused on meeting our customers' desire to adopt to clean energy solutions, including energy efficiency, rooftop solar, battery storage, and electric vehicles, or EVs. At the same time, California is experiencing the impact of climate change, from record wildfires to years-long drought and unprecedented heat waves. As infrastructure operators and planners, PG&E is doing everything we can to adapt to this reality and increase the resilience of our energy system. Our industry is at a remarkable crossroads. For PG&E, we see electric transportation as a vital opportunity to make more efficient use and resilient use of our electric grid, keep costs affordable for all customers, and enable emissions reductions in the transportation sector, which in California accounts for 40% of emissions and is a major contributor to poor air quality. It's hard to understate the benefits of electric vehicles. EVs powered by PG&E's low-emission electricity will lower transportation emissions. Since EVs produce no tailpipe pollutants, air quality will also improve, ideally for those disproportionately impacted living near highways, ports, and rail yards. EVs provide direct benefits to consumers in terms of lower, more predictable fuel and maintenance costs. For a PG&E residential customer, an equivalent gallon of gasoline costs just $1.60. Annually, an electric vehicle driver in PG&E service territory can save $1,200 in fuel and maintenance costs. Declining costs and increased variety of vehicle models have accelerated EV adoption in California, and already 1 in 5 EVs in the nation plugs into PG&E's grid. It's not just EV adopters benefiting from lower costs. As EVs add more demand to the grid, the fixed costs of maintaining and operating the grid are spread amongst more kilowatt hours, leading to lower electricity costs for all. Our grid will see other benefits and greater EV adoption, since this load is flexible and geographically distributed. Utilities can optimize their grid benefits in using EVs to soak up excess solar power and exploring ways to use EVs as resilient assets. Of note, PG&E has more than $400 million in approved EV infrastructure programs to support fleet electrification for medium and heavy-duty vehicles, public fast charging, and light-duty charging at workplaces and residential complexes. These programs include incentives for and deployment targets in disadvantaged communities, helping to ensure everyone can equitably access the benefits of EVs. PG&E also offers low and simplified EV charging rates and rebates to help lower the costs of ownership. And finally, through research and pilot programs, we're optimizing charging infrastructure, siting and usage to maximize grid benefits and support customer affordability. We believe federal policies can complement actions at the state level and help provide benefits to all customers. Specifically, we support federal investment and policies to accelerate deployment of charging infrastructure, particularly in ways that will address range anxiety and deployment in disadvantaged communities. We further support federal investment and encourage fleet electrification by transit agencies, federal, state, and local governments, tribes, and school districts. For other customers, incentives such as expanded tax credits can help accelerate adoption and drive down overall costs. Finally, increased federal research and development and technology innovation can help reduce costs of EVs and ensure their successful integration to the grid. We appreciate the opportunity to testify, and we look forward to continuing to partner with the federal government to realize the benefit of EVs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Giammona. Mr. Tom Lewis.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, thank you for your time today. My name is Tom Lewis, and I am a licensed civil engineer a founding board member of the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, and the executive leader of the Climate Resilience and Sustainability business at WSP USA. WSP USA is one of the largest engineering consultancies in the nation. We have more than 11,000 employees and roughly 140 offices across the United States. We deliver infrastructure solutions for hundreds of communities, including many in your own congressional districts. At WSP USA, we understand that our country and our planet are at a critical moment that demands focused and effective climate solutions. Based on our work across all types of infrastructure and all phases of its life cycle, we embrace our role as a force multiplier for positive change and believe that the business case for climate-oriented infrastructure solutions is very clear. The business case is reinforced every day as we provide services to reduce the depletion of natural resources, limit life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, and make infrastructure more resilient to disasters. This work includes the increased use of nature-based solutions, renewable energy, transportation system electrification, and equitable community engagement. Climate solutions for infrastructure need to be rooted in the quantification and consideration of future risks on a project-by-project basis. Unfortunately, proactive investment in risk mitigation has been absent from the vast majority of infrastructure programs and project selections across the country. As my fellow witness Troy Rudd mentioned, and according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 2020 saw an all-time record of 22 weather-related disasters that yielded economic losses in excess of $1 billion, in addition to the tragic loss of 262 human lives. This effectively highlights the extremely disruptive, expensive, and dangerous consequences of not funding and building smartly so that we are protecting against the risk of infrastructure failures, casualties, and loss of community lifelines and other essential services. Experience has taught us that increasing project capital costs by just a few percentage points to better future-proof our nation's infrastructure is a very wise investment. In fact, FEMA statistics show that each dollar spent on pre-disaster mitigation measures saves an average of $4 over an infrastructure element's lifespan. This noteworthy return on investment is especially compelling when you consider that capital construction and long-term budget planning almost always underestimate the costs and national resource impacts of long-term operation, maintenance, and repeated post-disaster repairs. Smart investment in life cycle resilience and sustainability must be prioritized to build better infrastructure going forward, that in turn lowers life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. The good news is that WSP USA has recently supported emerging project success stories in multiple states where sustainability, resilience, and risk considerations were central to infrastructure planning, engineering, and investment decisions on a project-by-project basis. These include projects in Massachusetts using a resilience-centric approach, in Florida and New York using nature-based solutions for coastal protection, and in California using a sustainability-centric approach for urban transit and for high-speed rail. Projects like these use a risk-based framework for assessing and protecting assets, natural resources, vulnerable communities, and the climate. This is the essence of applying a sustainability approach toward infrastructure and makes real the goal of achieving a favorable economic, environmental, and social equity triple bottom line. More frequent extreme weather events continue to endanger and impact vulnerable and under-resourced communities more than any others in both rural and urban areas. Therefore, in addition to creating physical resilience, climate solutions for infrastructure must establish increased economic opportunity and stakeholder buy-in through strategic engagement and meeting vulnerable communities where they are. To achieve equitable outcomes and maximize stakeholder buy-in, federal policies and funding decisions around infrastructure need to place the perspectives of all impacted communities at the center of the process. In closing, we believe that case-by-case, climate-based infrastructure solutions can and will meet this critical moment for our nation and our planet if the following business case performance objectives are promoted through good legislation, funding decisions, and policymaking. First, incentivize the selection, design, and construction of infrastructure projects that draw from and impact fewer natural resources, including the increased use of nature-based solutions, renewable energy, and transportation system electrification. Second, reduce life cycle greenhouse gas emissions and adverse climate and biodiversity impacts. Third, require that infrastructure be more resilient to future extreme weather events and climate. And fourth, prioritize the protection of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. Thank you for the opportunity to give this testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. And the final witness, Mr. Charles Hernick.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee. My name is Charles Hernick. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy with an organization called Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that engages policymakers and the public about responsible, conservative solutions to address our nation's energy, economic, and environmental security, while also increasing America's competitive edge. My hope is that you will take away three things from my testimony today. First, that federal policy must harness the power of free markets. Second, to make strategic investments in research and development and infrastructure. And third, and perhaps most importantly, reduce or eliminate barriers to infrastructure deployment. We live in unprecedented times, and 2020 was remarkable for a lot of different reasons, but specifically in terms of business and climate, 2020 was a record-breaking year for the number of companies that made voluntary pledges to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and get to carbon neutrality by mid-century. A record year for the number of power purchase agreements that were made by companies to reduce their emissions through the power that they're purchasing. A record year for the deployment of solar and wind. During 2020, under the most extreme economic headwinds that I've ever seen in my lifetime, that we've seen in many generations, solar and wind grew at 11%. 11% growth during an economic recession, and that's because demand for clean energy is at unprecedented heights. The free market can deliver the solutions that we're looking for and are needed. The types of companies that are making these voluntary commitments and pledges are in finance. They're some of the biggest banks that we can recognize. They're in transportation. I appreciate the comments and the goal set by FedEx. It's important to see that kind of leadership, but also in retail, from the folks that are selling us products, whether that be Amazon, Walmart, Target, other companies that are looking to reduce the environmental footprint of their products and their supply chains. The federal government can do more to help normalize this race to the top in terms of environmental performance. Mechanisms for transparency and accountability for these voluntary actions would be popular. A recent poll, my organization does a lot of different types of polling, but a recent poll in January showed that 70% of voters of all political stripes would support these types of mechanisms to help assure that the voluntary commitments that companies are making are followed through upon. And I think that that's a reasonable course of action. When it comes to making strategic investments in research and development and infrastructure, it's paramount that Congress pursue an all of the above approach. That includes efficiency, new fuels, and electric vehicles. For a long time, fuel efficiency has focused on how we squeeze more miles per gallon out of a car. But a new era of carbon capture utilization and storage, technologies and deployment make it possible and make the proclamations that oil and gas companies have been making to achieve net zero emissions in their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 categories a reality. It's important to look at that. It's also important to look at the new fuels that are coming onto the horizon. Looking at the hydrogen economy is important, has been mentioned already, but also electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are a small but rapidly growing part of the American fleet, and it's something that Congress should include in its all of the above portfolio. Finally, in terms of reducing or eliminating barriers to infrastructure deployment, too many of the big types of projects that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve our environment take up to 7 years or over a decade to permit. Congress should act immediately to codify one federal decision and reduce the timeline to 2 years so that we can put online all of the types of infrastructure in transportation, in clean energy writ large, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the pace that we need to achieve the voluntary goals that companies have set and the goals that we know we need to achieve globally. Finally, that type of action would be popular too. 73% of voters, again, of all political stripes, want to see reductions in red tape and limits to regulation that slow down unnecessary project delays. With that, I'll thank you and look forward to questions.
I thank the gentleman. That concludes the testimony. We'll now proceed to questions. Mr. Konar, in your testimony, you said in order to achieve the Biden administration goal of restoring 500,000 new EV charging stations over the next 10 years, and I don't even know if that's enough, that the federal government should be the bridge. And then, Mr. Rudd, you also mentioned the importance of interoperability of charging infrastructure. As we all know, Tesla is proprietary and has a great network, but no one else can charge there. And I think it is essential that we have an interoperable, charging network. So could the two of you address the appropriate role for the government in these areas quickly?
Sure. Go ahead, Mr. Rudd.
Yeah, as I said in my prepared comments, we believe that ultimately charging infrastructure needs to be universally available throughout the country, and especially in rural areas. At the same time, we also believe that there needs to be investment in innovation in terms of defining those standards and allowing for various forms of charging. So not necessarily charging stations, but perhaps things like dynamic charging. So as you're driving over large freeways or highways that are frequently used, you have the ability to charge your vehicles as you move. All that leads to, those standards will lead to the opportunity for innovation. And at the same time, we'll create the opportunity for forward thinking like smaller batteries in vehicles if you have things like dynamic charging. So we think before we embark on this journey and significant investment is made, that we spend some time to think about defining those standards so that we can all work together to achieve a common outcome, whether it's private or whether it's public agencies.
Okay, Mr. Konar.
Congressman DeFazio, the 2 points I would like to make is first, that we have done this before, right? So I feel very comfortable that the retail sector and this industry can actually respond to bring chargers in. When you look at renewable fuels and biofuels, which 10 years ago nobody wanted to use, with the right government policy, which was some tax credits and incentive structures for people like us to adopt this, we've been able to bring biofuels in a big way into the transportation infrastructure and significantly reduce the carbon footprint. Just the amount of biofuels pilot cells, we've taken the equivalent of 1 million cars off the road. So I think this is possible with good government policy, but we need to be bridged. At this point in time, the economics of standalone chargers and investing in chargers is very challenging, just because there's so much range anxiety and not enough people are using electric vehicles. So what would be very helpful from a policy perspective is if the government allows us to bridge through help of either from tax credits like we've done on wind and solar energy, or through grants in developing chargers, so that companies like us can go out and provide a ubiquitous network throughout the country so that there is adoption of EVs.
Okay.
And if you do that, over some period of time, we will get to a good solution. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Smith, you have a very ambitious goal to be carbon neutral by 2040. Is this purely a business decision, or is your objective also, centered around concern about and a need to reduce carbon pollution?
Well, it's some of both, Mr. Chairman. Our customers are increasingly focused on this issue. They want to do business with transportation providers who are environmentally responsible. But we also, as a commercial enterprise, have to produce for our share owners. And we're convinced in the vehicle sector, we have about 200,000 vehicles in operation. 3/4 of them are pickup and delivery vehicles. A little less than a quarter of them are over-the-road tractors, which drive, in this country, 2.5 billion miles per day. So battery-powered vehicles for pickup and delivery, which we began to pioneer over 10 years ago and strongly advocated government support for the acquisition of electric vehicles, have now reached the point where the positive profit accretion from about 24 or 25, you'll get both the environmental benefits and you'll get better economics. The operating cost of a electric pickup and delivery vehicle like the new BrightDrop electric pickup and delivery vehicles that General Motors just introduced will have an operating cost that's about 44% of what an internal combustion powered equivalent vehicle would be. So it's really just the acquisition cost, and that's coming down because of battery production efficiencies, and then the charging infrastructure. So we think there'll be a positive return on that. The over-the-road vehicles, that's harder. But electric vehicles are on the way. We have some on order. In aviation, that's the most intractable problem because of the difficulty in scaling up sustainable aircraft fuels. And it's why we made this big push to come up with scalable carbon sequestration methodologies led by the premier environmental school or university establishment in the world, the Yale School of the Environment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. My time has expired, Mr. Graves. No, sorry, wait, I had a list. Mr. Crawford, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Thank you for the witnesses for being here. I just got a couple of quick questions. I'll start with Mr. Hernick. America's greenhouse gas emissions are now below 1990 levels. How do we ensure that our good work here isn't sabotaged by China's increased use of polluting materials and activities?
Congressman Crawford, I appreciate the question, and it's a very important one for us to think about. China is the #1 greenhouse gas emitter in the world, and we have no reason to believe that they will be honest or transparent about their carbon emissions and what they're doing to reduce their emissions if they do anything. Transparency is their enemy, and we know that China will do anything to undercut us from an economic standpoint. So I think that what we need to be able to do is to pursue an all of the above approach that focuses on cost reduction so that American solutions that are clean are among the least expensive in the world. The climate challenge is a global one, and we need folks to be able to uptake American-made solutions in parts of the developing world, including Africa and Latin America, where folks are still looking to turn on the light switch or get their first car. And so that's why focus on cost reduction for customers instead of heavy-handed government approaches is going to be the way to go.
Thank you, Mr. Hernick. I have a question for Mr. Allen. China heavily subsidizes its national industry. Sometimes they even own the companies that are building their infrastructure. How do cheaper prices abroad affect your business model?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a great question. And clearly, there are numerous published reports now about, foreign state-owned enterprises and foreign governments and the way they provide subsidies to lower prices. That is absolutely happening every day in America right now on the battery system front. I agree, with Charles' comment. The way around this is to produce these products in the United States. We could use federal help on the investment side for Buy America. But today, most of the actual battery cells are not produced in the United States. They're produced in China, Korea, Japan. This is something that I hope the committee addresses quickly by providing incentives to bring that technology to the United States. It would bring intellectual property here and create numerous wonderful manufacturing jobs if we could produce the actual cells here in the United States.
Thank you for the response. Mr. Chairman, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Ms. Norton. I guess she's.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate this hearing. I regard climate change as the most important issue facing our country and, for that matter, the entire world. My questions first are for Mr. Allen and Mr. Rudd. The Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority, if it closes down, the Congress closes down. And they are prepared to move apparently on electric buses, but are finding issues with the manufacturing industry's ability to meet demand for battery electric buses. And I'm concerned and wonder what you believe could be done to support the scaling up of manufacturing to meet what is now a growing demand. And at the same time, I want to ask Mr. Rudd because you also mentioned the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit area, and that you were beginning on a strategy for an initial bus pilot. So I would ask you as well, what are the biggest challenges to electrification, excuse me, and how do you think the process could be sped up to meet the urgency of climate change? So first, Mr. Pretora. Mr. Pretora? I'm sorry, Mr. Allen, I'm sorry. Mr. Allen.
That's fine. Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, we do have Proterra buses running in Washington, D.C. Right now. We're very grateful for that. I think the way to continue to the acceleration of this is really on two fronts. One is for the government to continue the funding for zero emission buses and for charging. This is done today through the FAST Act Low and No Emission Vehicle Program. We would certainly, that program was funded last year at $130 million, this year at $180 million. We would love to see this program enhanced and further investment in here. This allows agencies to really kickstart their adoption of electrification in their transit business. The second is really around incentivizing the domestic supply chain. A little bit about my comments earlier about the battery cells, but if as the federal government makes a commitment that they are behind electrification and it's not going away, and this is the trend of the future, this will provide comfort to the supply base to be able to make the investments necessary to ramp up production in a much faster manner.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. With respect to the pilot program, I think what a lot of agencies are running into is recognizing how much capital is actually required for the transition, because it's not necessarily the acquisition of the vehicles or the electric buses. It really is delivering the power and the infrastructure to support those buses that is capital intensive. So in terms of the pilot, part of this is understanding how we can most effectively deliver power, whether it's using a portfolio of opportunities through natural gas, nor the normal power grid, or through green sources of electricity. And in facing that challenges of bringing capital to those projects, to see that there is an opportunity for a private-public partnership. There certainly is private capital in the world that would be willing to invest in the future of America and in the future of electrification. And as you've heard, is that there is an economic efficiency through electrification compared to combustion. So I believe there is an opportunity for private capital to get involved, to fund some of the significant expenditures that it takes to get these electrification projects off the ground and running in these larger communities.
One last question from Mr. Santana. Mr. Santana, in your testimony, you focused on zero emission freight trains. Now, in my district here in the nation's capital, we have one of the biggest rail hubs in the country leading to the Northeast and the Southeast. Is your company looking to apply that technology to passenger railroads as well? That's Mr. Santana.
If you could respond briefly, the
Representative,
gentle lady has run out of time. Just respond briefly.
This technology is very much applicable to passenger freight, to passenger trains as well. The reason we've really focused on freight is just impact and the amount of really emissions that we could eliminate by doing so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gibbs. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pardon? Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. I just want to reiterate the progress we are making in this country. The U.S. has already reduced emissions from 2005 by 17%, and we're on track to reduce our emissions from the 2005 levels by 25% in the next 4 years. So, and that's good to know, and also hear that from these companies that are working on do their part. One of my biggest concerns I have is that government, we don't pick winners and losers by our policy. The market function, and with technology changing as fast as it's changing and new technology coming on, you never know what's going to be next. And that's why I think the role of policymakers is maybe have incentives, tax incentives, and let the private sector make the determination what technology to adopt and use. And to go on, we talked about this hearing being the business case for climate solutions. I would hope that this community would push policymakers to adopt those kind of ideas to make sure that we don't have regulatory hurdles and red tape and bureaucracy that stifles the innovation and technology, because we're in an area here where it's so important to have R&D and adopt technologies as economically work. And with that thought in mind, there's been a little bit of mention about hydrogen, or otherwise known as blue gas and fuel cells. And I'd like to have whoever wants to chip in on that, the status is of that. And we all know, or should know, that fuel cell technology is improving pretty fast, and that it creates two products. One is electricity to run those electric motors in our vehicles, and the other is actual H2O, or water that's actually drinkable water. And so if anybody wants to comment on where they see what's happening in the hydrogen fuel cell technology, and if that's, I like to also say that anything we do policy-wise, we should include everything that's on the table and not prioritize a certain sector of energy. So if anybody wants to chip in, like Mr. Allen, the buses, what's going on there with fuel cells?
Certainly.
Et cetera.
Certainly. Thank you, Congressman. So Proterra today is exclusively focused on battery electric vehicles. We have studied hydrogen, but today we make a transit bus that provides over 300 miles of range within 1 day. And we find that matches up with over 95% of all the routes in North America today. So we believe that as the energy costs come down and as range goes up, we believe that at least in the transit bus world, the need for a hydrogen infrastructure won't be necessary, that battery electric vehicles can handle that. I don't think the same is true, as Mr. Smith said, for over-the-road Class 8 vehicles. I think today that's probably the best application for hydrogen, but I think time will tell as battery themselves get lighter and have greater range, whether they will be able to satisfy the needs of the over-the-road truck, along with dynamic charging for the infrastructure.
Let me ask you a question on the life right now, the current lifespan of the batteries. What is that? And then do we have an issue with disposing used batteries? How big of an issue is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So today, the Federal Transportation Authority requires our buses to last 12 years. So our battery system that we put on there will last 12 years, and we'll have a state of health acceptable at the end of that. That's required to be able to sell. So at the end of that period of time, or during that period of time, we will swap out batteries into those vehicles. Then the batteries still have 70% of their life left, or state of health. So we'll put them into secondary storage. This is a a fleet battery system that can provide backup energy to the fleets and to the grid. And then ultimately, the batteries that we use are able to be taken apart. The components are able to be recycled.
Okay, thank you. I just got 40 seconds. I don't know if anybody else wants to chip in on my hydrogen question.
Congressman Gibbs, if I may, this is Shamik Konar from Pilot. We have been looking at hydrogen quite a bit, and there have been a number of OEMs that are focused on hydrogen. The real question becomes for our over-the-road customers that are coming from, LA to Jacksonville, the EV, the range associated with batteries and the energy density doesn't seem to do it. So there definitely seems to be a lot of traction on the hydrogen side, especially for over-the-road vehicles where your weight you carry has to do with how much you get paid. And we do see a lot of interest on that, and we've been exploring alternatives to provide hydrogen at our sites if this does move forward.
Okay, thank you. I'm out of time to yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen. I've just comment. I've looked into hydrogen. We've got a number of very difficult problems. You can't put hydrogen in existing pipelines. It causes brittleization and failure. So you'd have to have a totally new distribution network for hydrogen. And secondly, of course, the question is green hydrogen. And at the moment, producing non-fossil fuel hydrogen is not particularly cost effective given the cost of the electrolysis and the hydrolyzers, but they're working on that technology. With that, I'd recognize the next, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question's for Mr. Smith, and it's with regards to airframe or airplane modernization. You got 2 OEMs available to you. How do you consider the life cycle of an airframe versus getting the fuel efficiency from a new airframe when you make a calculation about purchases? And do you get caught up at some point during the life cycle of that airframe where it's not, where you're not getting the savings out of it any longer?
Well, we've been in the midst of a major aircraft fleet modernization program for over a decade. And we have bought, I believe I'm correct, 187 Boeing 767s and Boeing 777s. And they were justified on the basis of substantially improved economics and operational capability. And we're confident in the aviation sector we'll be able to continue to do that, where we justify new airplanes based on their life cycle cost or their improved operating capabilities for our customers. What we can't do, though, is to make those airplanes zero emissions the way we can with our pickup and delivery fleet with electrification or some of the other technologies we've been discussing for over the road, including electrification. So that's why we have focused a lot on both sustainable aviation fuels and natural carbon sequestration.
Yeah, can you talk as well? Have you done any estimated fuel savings from your looking at the last mile drone delivery? And is that scalable?
The drone delivery, both vehicular and aviation, really only makes sense for same-day deliveries. The vast majority of parcels delivered in the United States, and that market by 2023, we estimate, will be about 130 million per day. The vast majority of them are moved overnight and then delivered in a loop route during the day. So drones really only make sense for same-day delivery, and we have an extensive effort, as I mentioned in my testimony, on a same-day surface delivery bot, which we call Roxo. You can look it up on the internet.
Yeah, I'll do that. Mr. Rudd from AECOM, can you tell me a little bit more about the role you play in eVTOL specifically with regards to the subject matter today about how eVTOL could play in congestion reduction or fuel emission reduction?
Certainly, thank you for the question. So the work that we're doing today is working on piloting some of the programs around electric aviation. But again, these are for short haul, or what I think you might describe as last mile. And the work that we're doing at the moment is looking at the infrastructure that will be necessary to build out and support a system, and then looking at the implications on the environment, the social networks in our communities around that. So it's really a broader study and a pilot to see how that infrastructure could be built to serve a smaller community in Southern Florida.
All right, yeah, thank you. I may follow up with you a little bit more on that. For the gentleman from Proterra, can you, are you making the case that, at least for for transit and for school buses, to leapfrog to electric and sort of skip propane and natural gas as a fuel?
Yes, we are. We believe that, propane and natural gas are really just a bridge to electrification. Certainly, both of those technologies provide environmental improvements over diesel, but the holy grail is zero emission vehicles that we get with electrification, and we believe that the technology is there today for transit agencies and school districts to move to 100% electrification.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Perry is scheduled to be next. He's not back yet, so we'll go to Mr. Babin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And Ranking Member Graves, I want to say thank you to our witnesses for giving us your time today. When we debate about carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, we must consider the issue from a global perspective. In order to actually decrease worldwide pollution, countries like China and India have got to be held accountable for their emissions, especially when regulations become so burdensome here in the United States that our companies are forced to outsource production to these major offenders because they have very little regulatory oversight. So I'd like to address my question to Mr. Hernick. How do we make sure that overly burdensome regulations are not forcing our domestic businesses abroad to other countries that are not playing by the same rules as we are? And if you would answer that, I have a couple more for you.
Sure thing, Congressman Babin. I appreciate the question. And I think that the most important takeaway is that it is a robust and positive business environment that is attractive for American companies, and robust competition that makes possible the types of emissions reductions that we've seen and that we need to see in the near future to be able to achieve our goals, but also maintain a competitive economy against other global interests that don't have our same interests in mind. Very specifically, Congressman Graves at the onset of this hearing mentioned how the free market was able to reduce carbon emissions in the electric power sector faster than the Obama Clean Power Plan. We should remember that for the transportation sector and assure that we're not drowning in red tape. And that's why in the written testimony, focusing on one federal decision to allow businesses to get a firm up or down on whether or not their project is able to proceed and not get caught up in years of reviews. I spent almost 6 years doing environmental and social impact assessments. There are a lot of good people in the field. And these are experts that, given a timeline, can meet it. And we should expect that. American businesses should expect that. And the U.S. government should be able to deliver.
Well, we just want to ensure, and how would we, that our reduced emissions here do not just simply transfer to increased emissions around the globe to other countries that don't live by these same rules. And do you think countries like China would implement or retrofit their industries with newer and more costly technology?
I can't speak for what China will or won't do. I know that the example that we had at the last Olympic Games that were in China was that they needed to turn off industry to meet to meet the standards that athletes required, and that they were willing to lie to the globe about what their emissions were until the U.S. Embassy put air monitors on the embassy. So we should remember that when dealing with China. That's why we do need to focus on low costs and a competitive environment, and we need to not foreclose on any of the options. Natural gas is a vital one. Russia is the number 4 emitter of greenhouse gases. And to the extent that we walk away from an international oil and natural gas market, that's a direct transfer of power to our geopolitical adversaries in Russia. And we should not, that shouldn't be we should focus on that as a part of the strategy to figure out how to deal with these foreign threats.
Absolutely. I think in my remaining time and again, we see the ingenuity and technological innovations that come from our private sector. I have the privilege of representing Southeast Texas, which includes the Johnson Space Center in Houston. It is here that we've seen so much success in leading the global pursuit of space by teaming up with the private sector. It's critical that we continue to pursue public-private partnerships and let our competitive market work to identify and solve solutions to our challenges. And so any suggestions you have that how we can modernize our infrastructure so that we can be spending our taxpayer dollars more wisely?
Well, sure. I think that the Starter Act that was proposed by Republicans in this committee last year is a fantastic foundation for that discussion. Focusing on strategic investments where the federal government works in partnership with states so that decisions aren't being made out of Washington, D.C., but are being made at the most local level possible on how folks actually get around. This is a big country, and the transportation differences between where I am in Annapolis to your home district and how folks get around in DC varies a lot. And that's something that's important for Congress to understand. And so pursuing an approach where federal dollars move to states or where federal public-private partnerships are possible is absolutely a necessary part of the equation.
Okay, thank you for that answer. My time's expired, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Just in response to Mr. Babin's, these are good questions about China. And the best way that I know of to respond to that would be through trade policy, where we establish standards. We meet the standards. They don't meet the standards. They pay a penalty on any goods they want to import that don't meet those standards. That's the best solution I've heard. Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing to discuss innovative policies that address the climate change. And I was particularly appreciative of the quote you made following your meeting on infrastructure with President Biden. You said, and I quote, "We are still living off the legacy of President Eisenhower to the detriment of our safety, our economy, our communities, and our environment. It's time to get out of the 1950s and move forward on a transformational infrastructure bill that puts millions of people to work building the infrastructure of the 21st century and beyond all, while putting our country on a path towards zero pollution." Thank you for working with me last Congress on a provision that I have been fighting for since the last FAST Act that would allow electric vehicle charging stations at park and ride rest areas. My district is home to the largest transit station on the West Coast, called the El Monte Transit Center, because FHWA has determined the transit center is on the highway, and the 2,000 parking spaces are not allowed to have electric vehicle charging stations. This is a problem throughout the country, including the Greenbelt Metro Park and Ride Station a few miles north of the Capitol. The question is for Ms. Giamona. The state of California has major plans to work with PG&E and other utilities to implement electric vehicle charging stations, but the prohibition on EV charging at many park and rides and rest areas has been a major challenge. Should Congress allow EV charging at park and ride and rest areas, and would this help expand EV charging deployment and reduce range anxiety?
Congresswoman, thank you for your question. We've been working with the state of California to implement charging at state parks, at community centers, at schools, and within tribes. We believe that federal policy and enablement of charging infrastructure where consumers and customers actually want it will be beneficial for all of the nation's consumers, that will help to eliminate range anxiety. But we
So what
believe
have you-
we believe it's in partnership.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Allen, Proterra, I've visited the factory in City of Industry. You're in my area.
Yes.
Thank you for testifying. I'm very proud to have you in the company in my district. And some of your fast charging stations, the fast charging buses are already in Foothill Transit, which is in my area. What have been the challenges to EV bus deployment? Are there additional maintenance challenges that working with local bus operators on this new technology? And how do you address those challenges?
Great. Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. And we're very proud of our relationship with Foothill Transit. They were the very first deployment of electric buses in this country with Proterra back in 2010. So they are certainly on the absolute leading edge of this technology. I think the challenges, I would say, are no more different than the challenges of any new technology. It just takes patience, and it takes time, and it takes a collaboration between the manufacturing, the supply base, the infrastructure people, and the agency. But we continue to progress with Foothill Transit and with other transit agencies around the country.
But what are you going to do about the challenges of working with the local bus operators on the new technology?
Well, training is certainly paramount. We have a relationship today within our facilities with the United Steelworkers, where we provide a training in partnership with the government. We focus on people of color, women, formerly incarcerated people to become employees within our facility, and we're very proud of that program in a public-private partnership.
That's wonderful. There are many things that I would like to see changed, and it would take a long time to try to get to them. But I think that training of employees, getting people to buy more electric cars, but if they don't have a place to charge them, they're not going to buy them.
Right.
So we have to work in tandem with that, with policy, plus all the other aspects of it.
We agree 100%. We're happy to follow up afterwards with you and your staff on more things we can do together.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, if I could
General-
just add a comment to the Congresswoman's question.
Very briefly. Very briefly.
Yes, sir. I think charging at park and rides make a lot of sense. I think one thing I would request the committee to consider is, as we go into EVs, the whole charging experience changes. You've gone from 2 minutes to fuel a car to 40 minutes or 30 minutes to charge your car. And when we look at public rest areas, those 40 minutes, if you can keep people more engaged and keep them more, give them more things they can do, like you get at our travel centers, or if you get at the retail stops where you can eat, you can shower, you can do other things. I think it'll only help adoption of EVs, and I think we've got to keep that in mind, because if you're stuck for 40 minutes in some place, and it's not very well trafficked, it
Okay.
doesn't have other amenities, it would be a challenge.
I thank the gentleman. Yeah, I was just commenting with Mr. Larson. Our rest areas in Oregon are pretty ratty, and people aren't going to want to hang around there. They're going to want to go someplace where there's a restaurant or something else for 25 or 30 minutes to recharge. So but California is pushing that hard. We'll see how we deal with it in the bill. So now we're back. Mr. Perry is still not here. So Mr. Graves from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first question I'd like to ask Mr. Lewis and Mr. Rudd. In 2018, we made extraordinary progress on a bipartisan basis to advance resiliency measures, to make investments in the resiliency of our communities. and by ensuring that disasters are rebuilt in a way that builds in a standard looking toward the future and more resilient infrastructure, more resilient communities. Can you talk about, you both have advocated for more resilient infrastructure, but can you talk about some of the regulatory challenges or obstacles that prevent us from doing that, or perhaps even tailoring a regulatory structure such as NEPA to the type of investments we're making, like green infrastructure investments that actually benefit the environment?
Yes, I can certainly start. First, on the issue of the resilience measures and mitigation, we basically have to be able to look at future conditions that are going to be very different than the conditions that were around when we wrote the current regulations, the current standards, building codes, and even some of our tools that we use technically. They've all changed. So we need to be able to project ourselves into the future, understand not just the physical conditions, but even the users of the future, how they might change. We see things changing, for example, in the vehicle usage and sense of automated vehicles that will change even the use of parking garages and things like that. So first, we need more flexibility in our regulations and in our codes and standards that allows for that kind of future look and for more agility and adaptability. I think in terms of regulations like NEPA, the problem is the open-ended timeframes. The private sector in particular, and also especially the innovators, tend to be most frustrated and sometimes even put out of business by the open-endedness of some of the timeframes that occur. So if the legislation and rulemaking and policies can all build some more hard deadlines and timeframes into the process, or give incentives, find ways to make it more predictable, because that's what's really holding back a lot of the deployment of new and innovative ideas and technologies.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to make sure we have time for
I want
to make sure we have time for Mr. Rudd to answer the question as well, please.
Yeah. So building on what my colleague said, one of the things that we look at when we look at the construction of infrastructure is we look at cost. So usually the elements of a bid for infrastructure are predefined, and our bid models that we use look at cost. What they don't look at is they don't look at sort of the probability weighted cost. Even though a climate event may be a low probability, the impact of it is very significant. So we need to think more holistically about the cost model and see, and some low probability outcomes in that. My suggestion would be to allow for non-conforming bids moving forward for infrastructure, so that people can include innovation and they can include resiliency and build a business case for it that may go beyond the current standards that we have for bidding projects and infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Mr. Smith, I'd like to ask you a quick question. You talked about how your company is voluntarily setting a standard for 2040. I just want to be clear, is there any government mandate or anything that you're being coerced to do this, or is this just a decision by the company?
The latter.
Okay, thank you. And then next question is if we're operating obviously in a global environment, as Mr. Crawford mentioned earlier, for every 1 ton of emissions we've reduced in the United States, China has increased by 4. They've increased by 4, resulting in a net increase in global emissions, and including under the Paris Accords, this is allowed. How do we, from an economic perspective, move forward on this? How do we establish a social cost of carbon whenever other countries' actions we have no control over and they're being irresponsible? So how do we value that as we look to a free market solution moving forward?
Well, I think one of the most promising areas is what Chairman DeFazio mentioned, that you might consider a border adjustment taxation, where if goods come into the United States that have not improved their carbon footprint, there's a tariff on them. And on the other side of the coin, we should have some sort of adjustment on our exports out from the United States when we have. The border adjustment tax is something that was carefully considered a few years ago, but if you combine it with carbon emissions, you could probably achieve the goal that you want, which is to incentivize foreign folks to do the same thing that we're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to make note with a border adjustment tax, you're disincentivizing or making U.S. economy less competitive. It need to be globally adopted, and I don't support that. But
Well, Mr. Graves, I don't agree with that, and I supported the TIACJ, and I think the biggest impediment we have to being export competitive is that we compete with people who have a value-added tax, and because of the historical trade agreements, we can't deduct our corporate income tax, and they can deduct their VAT. The VAT adjusted on the outbound would help our exports. I'd be glad to sit and talk to you about this, but I think it's positive for U.S. exports.
I thank the gentleman for his question, and I thank Mr. Smith. I have raised that issue about the fact we can't give an adjustment for our income tax, and they have the VAT, and we agreed to that in the 50s when we made everything in the world. But we don't care what they do. Who cares? They're going to buy it from us anyway. This is a different era, and I've talked to every trade representative about that, and they go, oh, yeah, hadn't thought about that. I said, well, you got to change that, or we are going to continue to lose market share. With that, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. Mr. Smith, you were talking in your introduction about the length of trucks and how maybe that could help with safety and with fuel economy. Would you go into more detail on that?
Well, there are about 3.25 million trailers in the United States. The vast majority of them are 53-foot trailers. They're the type that are operated by the truckload carriers where you pay by the mile, Swift, Schneider, J.B. Hunt, and so forth. There are about 300 and some odd thousand so-called twin trailers, where they are two trailers together, articulated. They're used by parcel and LTL or less than truckload carriers. There's only about 300,000 of them in the country. So if you extended the length to 33 feet, we would save about 225 million gallons of fuel, reducing emissions, take lots of vehicles off the road. They're safer. We operate them every day in many parts of the country. We've been operating them for years. For instance, in Florida, they're more stable. So we would advocate for that and have been for years.
The issue that people bring up when they talk against it is safety. Florida is it's pretty flat. I mean, you can go straight down from Tallahassee to Miami, and there's no mountain, there's no turn. How do these? Have y'all have experience with these around mountainous areas like East Tennessee or some other places?
Well, I don't think that the inherent safety of the 33-footers versus the 28-footers changes based on the topology that we deal with. I would just say, Congressman, every meeting at FedEx begins with safety above all. It is a centerpiece of our corporate strategy and our corporate philosophy. So we would not be advocating these if we did not believe that they were safer, not as safe, but safer. They're more stable, and they take thousands and thousands of trucks off the road, which improves safety by reducing the absolute number of accidents.
Now I'm going to ask you about two other futuristic things FedEx is looking at. One of them is the drones, and y'all have worked with the FAA and the Memphis International Airport on some drone research. How do you see drones and then Roxo, which is the little robots? And I would have probably given you a failing grade at GL2 on FedEx because I don't see the future as well as you do. How do you see Roxo and drones really integrating into the daily lives of people? I mean, you're going to put a Roxo out at Oak Hall and let them take delivery in East Memphis, or how's that going to work?
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, the biggest parcel market is the parcel market where people order something off the internet and get delivery overnight and in 2 days. Those items are transported overnight and then they are put on route delivery networks during the day. That's what we do with 150,000 vehicles around the world. There is no way that an aerial drone or a drone like Roxo can compete with a truck and an efficient driver doing that. But for same day, let's just say a pizza, which we all get from time to time, when you order a pizza, you have a driver that is driving a 2,500, 3,000 pound car delivering a 2-pound pizza. That is something that Roxo can do at a fraction of the emissions and a fraction of the cost. So it's the same day market for aviation drones and surface drones that have huge environmental and safety implications.
Well, my question is, and I just missed this, how does Roxo get to Pete and Sam's? Does FedEx have to take Roxo out there and drop it off, and then it goes around Park Avenue and the Dixon and all that?
No, Roxo is so cheap. Think about it like the parking lot at Target where you walk outside with your shopping basket. So Target would have the Roxos there, and when you order something from Target, a prescription, the Target people simply put it in Roxo, it goes to your house, you take it out, it goes back, and then is reused again over and over during the day.
So Roxos are all going to be out there in the field. They're not going to be out there at a central FedEx location. They're going to be more where the retail is.
Exactly. They will be located at the origin of the demand, and then when you order something within a few minutes, Roxo with virtually no fuel expended, certainly no traffic in your neighborhood of a 3,000 pound car delivering a prescription or a pizza will come and you'll take it out of the device and it'll go back to its point of origin. Its average delivery radius will be probably about 3 miles.
In 2006, you joined a group of, is that my time up?
Yep, sorry.
With that, I'd yield and go Falcons.
Mr. Boss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Connor, in your testimony, you talked about the fuel retailers' perspective on offering EV charging. It's been the private sector who has led in the way in the electric vehicle innovation. You mentioned that the fuel retailers are agnostic about the type of fuel they offer. Can you please expand on how companies like Pilot and smaller independent fuel retailers can help with providing the EV with making it economically viable?
Thank you, Congressman Wurst. So let me start by first saying the fuel retailer's goal is really to serve what our customer wants, right? So we're highly focused on providing the service that our customer is looking for. And I'll give you a great example, and then I'll talk about how it could work in this case. About 10 years ago, biodiesel and biofuels were definitely not something that were economic and were available in the market, and our customers didn't want it. Through the correct market incentives and public policy, what the federal government enabled us to do was actually provide cheaper biofuels to our customers, which has led to significant adoption of biofuels. So, for example, Pilot next year or this year should probably sell about 11 billion gallons of fuel, and we're going to sell 1 billion gallons of biofuels, which is a combination of ethanol and biodiesel and renewable diesel and so on, which has a significantly smaller carbon footprint and does something about it now at scale, right, which is equivalent to taking 1 million cars off the road. So the way we think about it is we have to get our customer comfortable with going into the EV market. And the three legs to that. One is the cars should be cost competitive, and we're getting there, right? We're getting there very rapidly with the amount of focus there has been on batteries and EVs. The second is the functional experience should work. As Mr. Smith talked about the longer trailers, the functional experience from the car should work, and I think they do. So the third part we need to solve expediently is basically how to deal with range anxiety and provide a fueling experience that's safe and has, kind of additional attractions for our customers and does not force them to change habits. And we are able to do that, and we're fully willing to do that. But today, the economics, just like in the adoption of biodiesel in the beginning or in the adoption of solar power or wind generation, are very challenging for us to invest and be able to do that effectively. So I think the way we can really enable this is get some support from the government, not just for us, but also for the utility sector who has to provide the green power, right? Because, if you're burning coal to to charge EVs, we're kind of destroying the whole objective of this. But really support the utility sector and support us so that we can provide the right customer experience and they can provide us the power. And then we can, kind of eliminate that third issue we're dealing with, which is range anxiety. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you. Mr. Gamana, are there any technologies or R&D that is needed to reduce the cost of EVs or to ensure that the grid can manage the new load? That's Mr. Gamana.
PG&E.
Thank you. Congressman, thank you for the question. Yes, we do believe and support R&D to really help support the grid nationwide, right? We are now having to operate the grid in a bi-directional fashion. So we think there's opportunities both from an R&D perspective to support the grid, as well as support and enhance vehicle adoption and support for what consumers need. We think there's an opportunity for the vehicle, as my colleague from Proterra mentioned, to become a battery storage. And we've been in trials with BMW and others to look at the second generation batteries and what they might do to help grid stability and operate as a battery. We also think there's an opportunity for electric vehicles to play a role in household resiliency in times of natural disasters, and that is vehicles with inverters. And we think that that R&D at a federal level could really help to accelerate the development in these areas.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
And just one real quick question for Mr. Smith now that I've gone down to a few seconds. Is that the Eagle Globe and anchor on your tie?
It is indeed. I served in the Marine Corps in 1966 to 1970.
Semper Fi.
Semper Fi.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Sires. Abio? Oh, perhaps he had to step out. Oh, is he?
I'm here.
All right, go for it.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Speak up.
Mr. Lewis, well, first of all, Chairman, thank you for this hearing. It's very interesting, very informative. And all the witnesses, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us and informing us. Mr. Lewis, in your testimony, you know data showing that each dollar spent on infrastructure risk mitigation and climate adoptions pays itself back at least 4 times over. Can you speak to the impact of incorporating efficiency in current and future? And here's what I'm talking about. I see all these tornadoes in the Midwest destroying everything. And they seem to rebuild them the same way that they were built before. Not as resilient as it could be for the future weather. I know the Obama administration tried to do something about it, but I just don't get it. The other issue I'll tell you is, in New Jersey we had this the Sandy storm, which cost about $30 billion in economic losses and damages, basically all along the beach, all along the shore. Yeah, people still want to build right next to it and build the same way. So can you talk about how we change that attitude?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. On your first question, the problem really stems from the Stafford Act, which has been around for decades. And when FEMA responds to a presidentially declared disaster, it's written in that the public assistance funding cannot be used to change what was there before. It basically incentivizes building the same thing back again, despite the fact that it's now proven that element of infrastructure is susceptible to failure and damage when a disaster occurs. So legislation needs to be created either by just modifying the Stafford Act or by overriding it in new legislation that allows for the evolution of of the building back after a disaster to include these ideas that will make, something better by just an incremental few percent increase in the cost. You can then make it so that the next time the same disaster comes, it won't have the same disastrous impact. As far as your question on building back in places that are proven to be susceptible, like the Jersey Shore, which, by the way, I lived at the Jersey Shore for over 10 years.
People want to live on the water. They want to
Yeah,
live on the
exactly.
water.
Exactly. And I think there's only two answers to that. Either you need to incentivize people to go elsewhere, which is very difficult in this country in particular, but there are some programs that do that by paying a fair price to properties that are in vulnerable areas where people may be sick of having to rebuild after multiple floods, or you need to build resilience. And there are nature-based solutions, putting natural reefs or other breakwaters, using smart biodiversity type solutions, like we're doing off of Staten Island, for example, which was a Sandy funded mitigation. And these are good ways to protect from the storm surge that occurs. So there are solutions that make places safer if you can't, in fact, relocate people.
Thank you. I was just wondering about electric locomotives and hydrogen fuel cells locomotives. Can somebody talk to me about that? I know some of the railroad companies are looking into a lot of these electrical locomotives. Can anybody talk a little bit about that? Anyone, take a shot. No takers? Is it good or is it bad? Mr. Kono.
Sir, I live in the world of trucks, but I will attempt to answer your question.
Oh, okay. Well, somebody.
I do think subject to what the chairman said, provision of hydrogen through non-fossil fuel based hydrogen becomes a challenge. But I think in locomotives, you actually have the ability of doing that because you're more centralized in where you fuel as opposed to trucks where you're fueling all over the country. So I think it is a problem that is solvable, but I'll be honest, I have not looked at the economics on the locomotive side and the power and the hauling side as I have looked on the trucking side of it.
All right. Well, I don't have any more questions. Thank you, Chairman.
Representative, can you repeat your question, please? It's breaking up.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, about hydrogen fuel locomotives. And,
Representative, can you please repeat your question?
Yeah, you can't hear me?
Representative, please repeat your question.
Albio, you're out of time. I'm sorry. Okay. Ms. Steele.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all the witnesses coming out today. We have.
Representative, can you please repeat your question?
Your microphone's on. Please shut off your microphone. Ms. Steele.
We have heard from many experts today that market-based innovation is working successfully. In Orange County, I have been many local, small, mid-sized, and large companies voluntarily achieve carbon neutral status. California companies are proactively investing in plans to cut carbon emissions without additional regulations being enforced by government by any level. We must be careful when we talk about creating new taxes or shifting our tax code. We have seen many times that heavy-handed mandates only cause more confusion and burdens. The government is not good at picking winners and losers. The federal government must allow for flexibility, and we must eliminate barriers to major infrastructure projects by streamlining permits and modernizing the environmental review process.
Hopefully you can hear me, Mr. Representative.
Hold on. She is making a statement. I don't know who's talking. It's her time.
I want to ask Mr. Lewis the question. What hurdles have you encountered as project manager for the California High-Speed Rail project? Have California's environmentally, environmental regulations been easy to abide by since California has much harder regulations than any other states?
Yes, we have been able to work with the California High-Speed Rail Authority in a case-by-case basis to evaluate the different opportunities for sustainability and resilience elements within the program. And each one can have its different challenges, especially with regard to anything that has air emissions associated with it because of the very stringent rules on air emissions in the state of California. So that's where you see the biggest challenges. But luckily, a lot of the sustainability and resilience elements that we're building into the program don't involve the emissions. And so the regulatory hurdles are easier to deal with. But it really is a case-by-case basis. And you have to be willing to think outside the box and really address each of the challenges with their own set of requirements and timeframes.
As you may know, the California High-Speed Rail project had its federal funding terminated in 2019 for failure to comply with the grant terms and failure to meet deadlines. Do you believe it is right for taxpayers to continue to fund the California High-Speed Rail project? If so, what is the WSP's plan to fix this project going forward? What has changed about the project in 2 years to warrant more federal funding? Mr. Lewis?
I apologize. For some reason, I couldn't hear you until the last 5 seconds there. Can you repeat the question?
Do you believe it is right for taxpayers to continue to fund the California High-Speed Rail project? If so, what is the WSP's plan to fix this project going forward? What has changed about the project in 2 years to warrant more federal funding?
Well, we're working through all the different elements of the program, which is broken into different sections, of course, and each one has its own issues and challenges. So we're taking them in partnership with the California High-Speed Rail Authority, piece by piece, issue by issue, and we're coming up with solutions that absolutely justify the project going forward, in our opinion.
But it's been already failed for all the deadlines and all the agreement. So you think that moving forward, you're going to meet another deadlines and you need another federal funding?
Well, yeah, again, each issue has its own path to solution and time frame. There have been some challenges that have been taken on and have been evaluated and coming up with the solutions in partnership with the High-Speed Rail Authority. So yes, we feel like we can move forward in a very effective way.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman, or sorry, gentlelady yields. We'll go to Mr. Johnson next. Okay, it looks like Mr. Johnson might be voting. We'll go to Ms. Titus.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I represent the Las Vegas Valley, and we're thought of with lots of neon signs and glitz and glamour. You don't think of us necessarily as being out front when it comes to climate change, but that's really not accurate. We have a lot of LEED standard gold buildings. MGM Resorts has said they want to slash their carbon emissions in half by 2030. Big developments of solar power throughout the Las Vegas Valley. Steve Sisolak, our governor, is trying to have the state meet the Paris Agreement standards. And also we have a state senator, Chris Brooks, who's introduced a bill that would require $100 million investment in EV charging infrastructure. But an interesting part of it is that 40% of that infrastructure has to be built in historically underserved communities. So I'd like to go back to that EV infrastructure issue a little bit and ask Mr. Konar, to talk about this. I support President Biden's efforts to invest in this and his goal of 500,000 new charging stations. We need this infrastructure available along I-15 that connects us to California. You have a couple of service stations and facilities along that road. If I-11 is built between Las Vegas and Phoenix, that would be another perfect place for this. I wonder if you could talk some more about the public-private relationship for establishing these stations, and also what we can do to be sure that they're built in some underserved communities, not just in more affluent neighborhoods.
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman Titus. So I'd like to kind of answer this in two parts. One is, your point about building infrastructure on highways. From my perspective, and that is what I'm way more qualified to speak on because that's what we do. Our focus there is reducing range anxiety, and we actually at Pilot right now we have 58 charging stations. Some of them in Arizona and in West Texas and then up in Washington. And as we looked at the data from these charging stations, what we've been seeing is that our utilization rates at these charging stations are way less than 1%. So, if you build a piece of infrastructure and it's being used less than 1%, as a fiduciary to your shareholders, it's very challenging to make that case. So I think the federal government coming in and assisting us, especially during these early days, where I don't doubt if you were talking 10 years from now, that utilization number would be very different. But we need to incent the customer to drive and to charge. So we want to put that out there because it's the chicken and the egg problem that we're suffering from, right? If there are no charging stations, people don't buy EVs and people don't go ahead and travel. So we really, both us and the utility sector, I think, could benefit from getting help from the federal government in these early days so that we get adoption and we get to a critical mass. To your second question, as it relates to inside the cities, that is a little bit of a different kind of issue, and maybe the lady from Pacific Gas and Electric could give you a better view on that. But in terms of highways, I think we can definitely make this work, and we definitely need some help from the federal government, as do the utilities, to get the infrastructure to us.
No, thank you, and I'll ask her, but I would think there would be a demand for it along those. I-15 is just such a busy corridor. And then all our hotels welcome so many driving travelers from California. You'd think there'd be some incentive to put them there. We're exploring everywhere. We're exploring partnerships with people. And I've just been as surprised by the data as you are right now. And in fact, in preparation for the hearing, I pulled data from our stations as well as one of our partners out in Utah. And we're both at less than 1%. And it makes the economics very challenging right now. But I do think range anxiety, I'll just cite a study done by Morgan Stanley. They polled a lot of EV owners, and range anxiety, almost 50% of the people who would potentially buy EVs said they wouldn't buy them because of range anxiety. So we do need to solve that. Thank you. Anybody else want to comment?
Congresswoman, I really appreciate the question. I would offer that in California, what has really helped the California utilities in partnership with our commission and state regulators we have focused goals on disadvantaged communities. So our programs and incentives are focused on meeting specific targets to ensure we have charging infrastructure built in multi-dwelling units.
Ms. Chiamano, do you mind if we maybe come back to the remainder of the question? The gentlelady's time has expired.
Well, thank you. Maybe we can be in touch and I can learn more about it.
That's great. Happy to follow up with you.
Thank you.
Mr. Stauber is recognized for 5 minutes.
There we go. Now it's on. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the witnesses. A few questions. Mr. Allen, For your electric vehicles, what country are the minerals like copper, nickel, and cobalt used in your batteries and computer systems sourced from?
The battery cells that we get today are from Korea. They're nickel, cobalt, and magnesium are the main ingredients. But I'm afraid I don't have the information with me about where our supplier sources them. I do know that all of the suppliers that we deal with are in compliance with the OECD due diligence requirement around conflict minerals. So we do have.
Yeah, Mr. Allen, I would like to inform you that most of the minerals come from the Congo and China. And does the Congo, Mr. Allen, does the Congo and China have better or worse labor and environmental standards than the United States?
Well, I think that's an obvious answer to that question is that they don't, sir. But as I was saying, we do work with the suppliers that we have to ensure that they pass the due diligence guidelines, that they are not buying products that violate human rights in our supply chain.
And again, the Congo and China do not have the environmental and labor standards the United States does. My next question, Mr. Hernick. What are some of the global environmental benefits to mining and sourcing critical minerals in the United States as opposed to foreign countries with little to no environmental standards?
Well, Congressman, this is a values question. This is what do we stand for as Americans, and for Americans, we stand for pride in our work and human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and these are rights that we have that a lot of the countries that you're talking about, China and DRC in particular, they don't have. So when we're doing business with these countries and sourcing materials from them, we are supporting regimes that undermine American interests very specifically.
And would we, Mr. Hernick, would you agree that if we purchase critical minerals mined in the Congo and China, especially in the Congo, there's child labor, forced child labor to mine, for instance, the cobalt?
We know that. And as the father of 4 daughters, that makes me very uncomfortable. And it's one where we need to be open to all of the above approaches to solving the climate problem and sourcing minerals and looking in our own backyard and not being afraid of fulfilling our high environmental and labor safeguards and utilizing the resources that we have in our own country here.
And I think that I want all the witnesses and my members of the T&I committee know that in northeastern Minnesota, we have the largest copper nickel find in North America. We are, at least one company is in its 19th year of permitting and fighting court battles. We have the best environmental and the best labor standards in the world. The Northeast Minnesota corridor, the Iron Range, hosts the Duluth complex of this copper nickel find. We do it best, and I would suggest that we put a lot of effort into mining manufacturing be brought back to the United States. Mr. Chair, it is clear that the committee has heard today that we have found the climate solution that also has a great business case. We can mine our critical minerals in the United States. We can refine these minerals in the United States. We can extract and transport our fuels in the United States and bring back building and manufacturing items of importance into the United States using the best labor standards and the best environmental standards. Nobody does it better than the United States. And the best part of all of this is that we're following our labor and environmental standards. We emit the least amount of carbon when we environmentally source it right here in our country. In northern Minnesota and the Iron Range stand ready to source these materials in an economically pristine and friendly way.
The gentleman's time has
I
expired.
yield back.
Mr. Huffman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank the chair for a great hearing. It has been suggested by some, though, that just because we've begun to reduce emissions over the past decade, that we're doing just fine. And we should just pat ourselves on the back and continue business as usual. I wish that were so, but the truth is we're not doing great. We are on track to lose this climate fight if we don't dramatically change course. And just because we're finally starting to reduce emissions doesn't mean that we didn't put most of those greenhouse gases up there over the past century, and we're still one of the world's biggest greenhouse gas polluters. So the truth is we are playing catch up here. We are running out of time, and we can't indulge fantasies or invitations to slow down or rest on our laurels or otherwise continue. Madam Chair, if I could get a little credit on time and maybe come back to Mr. Smith, I'll move on to my other question.
Jared, unfortunately, I announced at the beginning he'd have to leave in 2 hours, and he stayed longer than that, so he's no longer available.
Well, darn, I thought I had a pretty good question for him. Let's go to PG&E. Ms. Giammona, and I hope I'll get a little break on time since I missed out on Mr. Smith. But California is obviously on its way to 100% clean electricity portfolio. That's exciting. We're leading the way on vehicle electrification. And so the move to EVs won't just reduce tailpipe emissions, it's going to be clean all the way around. But we're also struggling to have a grid that avoids rolling blackouts, that doesn't spark wildfires. We're not alone. Clearly, Texas has huge problems. It will need to make a bunch of investments in its grid. Obviously, today, in many parts of the country, our grid is not ready for millions of new EVs, adding all of that load. But we're planning for the future. And I want to ask you, will the grid be ready? What gives you confidence that our grid will be able to handle all these EVs in the next decade or two? And what federal policies would maximize your confidence that we can get there?
Congressman, thank you for the question. As you know, we're making significant investments in California in PG&E's grid with our system hardening, our undergrounding projects, and really in an attempt to modernize the grid to withstand the climate changes that we're experiencing in California, but more importantly, be ready to adapt for new and cleaner technology that customers want and need for the future. So I feel very confident in California. We're working very closely with our regulators, our policymakers, and I really see this as a concerted effort. It's not one utility, it's the utilities in partnership with good policy and strong regulators in the state. As we think about it more nationally, we're working in partnership with all of the utilities through Electric Edison Institute and EPRI to really ensure that we're taking advantage of the best technology, R&D resources out there to modernize the grids. But we are an infrastructure company. We planned that infrastructure, and I think working with third-party markets, working with customers, and really understanding what the future of energy is going to look like, coupled with strong policy, strong R&D, and strong support from the federal government, we're going to be ready for this.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate you bringing these folks to us. Mr. Konar, many folks think of Pilot Flying J as just a gas station company. Can you talk a little bit about some of the other parts of Pilot's business, particularly the biofuels program and the low carbon fuels?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. What I would say is, I would say Pilot Flying J is a customer service company. Our goal is to provide the on-highway drivers, and who've just been amazing heroes through the pandemic, as as they continue delivering goods and services, and today vaccines, as Mr. Smith talked about, FedEx. Our goal is to support them in whatever way we can. And in addition to that, now Pilot Flying J has also become a center for the four-wheel customer, right? The gas customer that's driving on the road. So our goal as Pilot is to be a customer service-oriented company and deliver to the customer what they want to buy, where they want to buy it, and at a price that they're willing to pay. So, when we talk about renewable fuels and when we talk about reducing carbon footprint, I think the public-private partnerships that we've talked about during this hearing, as well as partnerships between Pilot Flying J and the utilities, would be a great solution to go ahead and reduce carbon footprint for the transportation sector, right? Because the utilities need money today in order to help their infrastructure. As we discussed, it's not just the EV pressure that's going to hit the utilities infrastructure. Remember, we're trying to green the whole country. And the utilities are the one that provide power. We change industrial processes, we change boilers, we change everything. The utilities have to get the green generation and deliver the power to us. So they need help. We need help in order to get us going, because at Pilot Flying J, we're in 44 states. We've got 1,000 locations around the country. So we can actually step in there and say that, look, and our retail fuelers who work with us can step in there and say, you can drive an EV from LA to Jacksonville and not have to worry, because every 100 miles, I can get you food, I can get you Wi-Fi, I can get you fuel, I can get you a shower, I can get you an ATM machine, whatever you need, right? And I think this kind of gets lost in the mix when we talk about things like rest areas and when we talk about trying to develop new infrastructure. Our goal as a country and as a community should be to leverage what's already in place, make it attractive for the customers so that they step in and start demonstrating the behaviors we want them to, and then use all our public funds to basically bridge us to the point where this is economic and it's taken up in enough scale that we can do it with private investment. To me, that would be the perfect solution. I know it was a mix of what does Pilot Flying J do, but really, my goal here is to try to reduce the carbon footprint and use all the efforts from this committee as effectively as possible so that the right people get the right amount of support and we can move forward.
Yes, sir. Hey, and I know y'all started as a single gas station, but what prompted the company to change its business model and grow over time? Was it because of government mandates or private market decisions?
It was completely because of private market decisions, because we saw a need for truck stops, because as you know, trucks can't fuel at gas stations because of their size and because, a truck needs to fuel at 14, 15 gallons a minute. Otherwise, the driver is going to be sitting there forever, which is a problem we have to solve on the EV side. So completely on market incentives.
I figured that, knowing Mr. Haslam. Hey, I'd guess that Pilot is the largest employer and taxpayer in many of the communities where your truck stops are located. How many employees have you generally have at your locations, and what do these travel centers mean for those communities?
It's a great question, because a lot of our travel centers are in very remote communities around the country where there aren't jobs, and we often end up being the only source of fuel or food or amenities for a lot of the local communities. A travel center on average has, depending on the size, between 60 to 80 people that we hire in local communities. Pilot employs about 28,000 people around the country, and a lot of them live in very rural environments. But the interstate business and keeping America moving is a way for them to get a livelihood. So we are very appreciative of that.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time. And I wish, Mr. Chairman, if you could express to leadership that we need to schedule better. This is a very important committee. and the members are not, I don't think we're being served when we have to rush out and vote. Dadgummit, if we need to vote, we ought to vote until midnight or later. We're here to work. And this is very aggravating, and I don't think it's fair to the committee for us to continue our important work.
Well, I share the gentleman's frustration, but in part, we're having this many votes because some members on his side of the aisle are insisting on votes on non-controversial legislation.
I understand that, Mr. Chairman, but this problem preceded all of that. So thank you.
Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this meeting. I'm going to have to be brief because I do have to go and vote. But I wanted to ask a question of Mr. Allen. And Mr. Allen, I thank you for your testimony. And I think in your written testimony, you mentioned my bill, the Green Bus Act. And this is a bill, as you know, that would set a national goal for zero emission buses and for it would require that beginning in 2029, all new buses that are purchased using federal funds be zero emission buses. So I know, I know you are helping California meet its goal because this bill is modeled after what California is doing. So my question is, how can you and I presume other bus manufacturers help transit agencies across the United States to meet this goal?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think in my mind, there's a number of areas that the committee and the federal government can help on. The first is to increase the funding for zero emission buses through the Low-No emissions vehicle program and reauthorize that program and step up the funding. The second would be to incentivize domestic supply chain. There's an existing program called ATVM, and that program unfortunately is only used for, or only allowed to be used for, automotive and light duty vehicles. We would love to see that program enhanced for heavy duty vehicle suppliers and heavy duty original equipment manufacturers. And this would allow companies to invest in state-of-the-art manufacturing and build the domestic supply chain that many of the discussions today have been about, that will allow us to compete against aggressive foreign competition. This will also entice foreign battery cell manufacturers to come to the U.S. with their intellectual property and create jobs here in America. And then the last area I would say is around supporting programs for fleet electrification beyond the Low-No program, and that specifically is around school buses and municipal fleets. Today, school buses are not funded at all by the federal government. They're funded state and locally, and I believe a program to have the federal government help electrify school buses would go a long way towards our challenges on climate.
Thank you so much for that. And actually, thanks for mentioning the ATVM program, because Congresswoman Dingell and I have a bill to do exactly what you've suggested, to expand that program to medium and heavy duty vehicles. So thank you for the plug. The last question, and quickly, is, I think a green economy is going to create lots of good jobs. And again, Mr. Allen, can you talk a little bit about the wages and benefits that your company offers, and how, because I think we're looking for good paying jobs, and I think in your company there are good paying jobs to be had.
And they are. This is this is not what I would describe as just everyday manual labor. This is advanced manufacturing. We train our employees to be able to do very technical positions. They don't require anything more than a high school education to do that. We do the training for them in conjunction with some of the programs we have with local community colleges. And these people come to work and they make a really decent wage in both South Carolina, Los Angeles, and in Northern California. We provide our employees 401k matching, and we also provide every single employee at Proterra stock options for when we ultimately go public. Every single employee will benefit from that.
Thank you so much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Next up is Councilmember Mast. Congressmember, excuse me. Congressmember Mast, is he still on? We can come back to him, certainly. Okay. Then how about Congressmember Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first line of questioning will be for Ms. Giammona with Pacific Gas and Electric. And ma'am, I spent 6 years as a utility regulator in South Dakota, a member of the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission. And I like that you called out in your testimony, ma'am, the importance of balancing safety, reliability, affordability, and sustainability. I don't think many ratepayers understand the importance of balancing those sometimes competing interests for an investor-owned utility. Of course, we've been talking today about government intervention and how it can expedite some of this progress that my colleagues are looking for. So I guess my question would be, from your perspective, ma'am, to what extent have regulations, requirements, mandates from the California PUC or from the state legislature hindered your ability, your company's ability, to properly balance those four critical stakeholder interests? And maybe rate that from 1 to 10, 1 being no intervention or constraint, and 10 being the regulators have made all the decisions for you.
Congressman, thank you for the question. I think my opinion is it's a partnership, and our regulators in California are very focused on and have the same interests that we do, and that is providing safe, reliable, affordable, and clean energy to the consumers in California. And as such, we have, not only aggressive policy and aggressive goals, but we have been really far ahead on program design in the areas of energy efficiency, our solar incentives, demand response, community choice aggregation. We've run the gamut of energy programs, and that's really
Ms.
been in
Giammona?
partnership with our regulators.
Yeah, thank you. And I do understand the suite of offerings that you all have offered and deployed some of them in South Dakota in my time as a regulator. I mean, it sounds as though you do view this as a partnership and that you largely or maybe completely endorse the regulations and requirements within California. I mean, given that, a rating on a scale from 1 to 10, I mean, how do you feel like PG&E has been able to balance safety, reliability, affordability, sustainability?
I would say that, I would love to rate us as a 10. I think the challenges that we have faced are climate changes. So what we've experienced is, the climate is changing and our conditions are changing rapidly. And we, as you know, utilities are, we have major infrastructure with large cycles of depreciation. And we are finding ourselves having to be much more nimble to respond to what is now a new climate in California. So we're really working closely with our regulators to ensure that policy moves quickly so that we can act upon that policy and really act to support the climate in California.
Well, and I would just, say this. I mean, clearly, I think it should be important to all of us on either side of the dais here. This issue we're talking about, clearly, we need to build systems that are increasingly environmentally friendly, that provide some sustainability. I would push back on your characterization that PG&E in California should get a 10 on balancing these interests. And I would just perhaps call out my state of South Dakota. Again, I've got some pride having been a regulator there, but you bragged, and I think understandably so, about how green your fleet of generation is. I think South Dakota has a lot to brag about as well. 70% of our electrical generation in-state comes from renewable sources. But I think I'm concerned there has not been a proper balancing of ratepayer interests, the affordability issue, when y'all have made decisions. And when you look at the residential price per kilowatt hour, in South Dakota, it's 12 cents, and in California, it's 22 cents. Now, that's an overly simplistic way to look at it, I admit, But that's 86% higher. And we're 70% renewable. You say you all are 88%, and that's a great number. But I mean, if we are going to hold up, if we're going to say, ma'am, that California is a 10, that PG&E gets a 10 on balancing affordability and sustainability, then I think we just need to acknowledge that you're willing to pay an 86% premium at the rate level to be able to secure that 10, and I just don't know that that's the proper way to balance. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up will be Congressmember Payne. All right. Okay, please unmute. Congressmember?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, Mr. Santana, as chairman of the subcommittee on railroads and pipelines, hazardous materials, I care a great deal about the effects of rail transportation on the environment. New technologies have the potential to significantly reduce the railroad sector's carbon footprint. Other countries have recently put trains into service that are powered by hydrogen fuel cells. The United States should take advantage of opportunities to integrate innovative technologies that could provide efficient rail service while reducing carbon emissions. Can you explain the potential benefits of hydrogen-powered trains and how quickly the United States could get to a position to take advantage of this technology?
Representative, hydrogen will play a role in terms of decarbonizing rail. To your point, we've seen other countries taking steps in that direction, like China, for instance, like Europe, and we should take the lead here. When we think about the roadmap to decarbonize, we could very much, as you think about batteries, where we are applying it now in effective ways into rail, you will get to that same point on hydrogen. And what you're going to be seeing is a number of these technologies permeating different industries, getting to economies of scale that will allow this to be efficient, to be competitive. So we might take a lead there.
Thank you. Mr. Rudd, 9 years ago, Hurricane Sandy provided a stark reminder of how climate change can result in more extreme weather and greater harm to our infrastructure. Along the Northeast Corridor, this means that any infrastructure projects needs to consider the increasing number of hurricanes and other significant weather events. Can you explain the cost of failing to make substantial investments in the resilient infrastructure now?
Yes, and building off something one of our colleagues said a little earlier was when we look at the economic cost, it really has a 4-to-1 relationship. So underinvesting in resiliency today, although it is a generalization, it comes with a very heavy cost without making those initial investments. And with respect to some of the things you're talking about, it gets back to the point about thinking about our procurement model and building into the procurement models for future infrastructure the opportunity to build in innovation and to build in the cost of resiliency and evaluating that in the low-cost models that are currently used to make those infrastructure decisions.
Thank you. Also, Mr. Rudd, it goes without question that the public and private sector must work together to meaningfully address the pressing issues around climate change. How do you envision the roles for the public and private sectors in creating a climate-forward model of infrastructure investment and construction?
Well, again, when we look at the infrastructure investment that's required, one of the largest challenges is going to be the funding itself and the capital improvements. And so as we look forward, there are economic opportunities to improve that infrastructure that the private sector would be willing to participate in and willing to fund. And my suggestion would be that, as part of the infrastructure bill, you look for opportunities to de-risk those private sector investments and to lower the cost of capital for those fundings, effectively creating an opportunity for a higher return or an appropriate market return for that private investment. There's so much capital is required for this. I think the only way that we can move forward successfully at the right pace is to provide an incentive so that there is public capital and private capital coming into these infrastructure investments.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. I appreciate that outlook. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Next up is Congressmember Nels.
Thank you, Chair. The U.S. has led the world in reducing emissions for 2 years now, and this largely has been due to the wider adoption of natural gas. Refrigerated methane, more commonly known as liquid natural gas, has the potential to continue the American energy revolution, reduce dependence on foreign energy sources, and continue to help our environment. I have 2 questions, and my first is for Ms. Giammona from PG&E. In February, in my home state of Texas, we saw the tragic consequences of becoming overly reliant on certain energy sources. What role does fuel diversity play in ensuring that we have a reliable and resilient grid?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And it was really difficult to watch what was happening in your state during the crisis in February, and know that our hearts are with the families and customers that were impacted by those extreme weather conditions. We've been really focused on diversification of our fleet for a number of years, leveraging renewable power sources, but also leveraging our natural grid infrastructure. And I think going forward, each state is going to look a bit different on how they plan to diversify their fleet in order to support the customer demand of new technologies, but in addition, provide reliable power sources for customers as we're managing through a changing climate.
Thank you. My second question is for the rest of the panel. We've seen a number of northeastern states either limit or outright ban pipelines carrying American natural gas through their states. This has led to other states in the region having to look outside the U.S. for their natural gas supply, including to places like Russia. This not only harms our energy independence, but is also more harmful to the environment, given that our environmental standards far exceeds Russia. How can we better spur American infrastructure development and enhance U.S. geopolitical strength? Thank you, and then I'll yield back.
Congressman, this is Charles Hernick with Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. I'd like to jump in on that. I think that your point underscores the need for an all-of-the-above approach to energy. That includes oil and natural gas. And it includes, some of the other technologies that we've talked about here. Very specifically, as it relates to, we need to create opportunities for fuel switching. One of the easiest ways to do that that's not been mentioned, we've spent a lot of time talking about switching to electric vehicles, but emissions can be reduced quickly and at a cost savings to school districts, municipalities, by switching from diesel to propane, just as for example. So there are very important areas where we can reduce emissions now, create cost savings now. It doesn't need to be always a trade-off between reducing emissions and high economic costs. There are ways to do this in a way that create options for customers, create options for states and municipalities, and reduce emissions quickly and really improve livelihoods for people instead of waiting for that more expensive option that may still be a little further down the road.
Congressman Mills, if this is Shamik Konar, if I may just add to that, this is a great point. The renewable fuel standard, which has been in place, which has been enhancing the use of biodiesel and all the biofuels, is something that works today. And as we think about policy for reducing our carbon footprint, we should look at everything that we have at our disposal, which is a great point Mr. Hernick makes, which is that we can still bridge our way to EVs being adopted, hydrogen coming in, going from 1% utilization to 30% utilization. By continuing to push the things that work today, to your point about natural gas, we can be doing that today while we wait for our future, because just waiting for the big bang costs us time. And all of these things will take a substantial amount of investment, and that takes time.
If I may just offer a contrarian view that, today, the school buses don't require a truck stop in order to be refueled. They go back home every day to their own spot. The total cost of ownership for school buses to be all electric is there today. There's really, in my mind, no need to make an interim stop at propane. The economics for electric school buses is viable today.
No, it's
Thank you very much. We're out of time on that for that 5-minute period. So we'll move on to the next member to ask questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
The next questioner will be Congressmember Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all our panelists. I found this discussion fascinating, both in terms of what can be done in the short term and also really maybe looking at more long-term solutions. But I want to focus on a specific challenge that we have. It's been mentioned, but I really want to dig a little deeper, and that's heavy-duty vehicle electrification, which is a critical priority for reducing freight emissions. I represent the Port of Long Beach, and within the port complex, Long Beach and the Port of LA together, there's a huge number of truck traffic in and out of those ports. We're talking about 30, 40,000 trips a day, at least. And we're talking about having, and I've seen over the years the ports have done a great deal in terms of reducing the impacts upon those communities around the ports, which tend to be lower income communities, which suffer greatly from asthma and other types. Not all due to trucking, obviously. We have ships and trains too. But I want to talk about now, and what's interesting is during this pandemic, while there was a drop in volumes through the ports, there has been a tremendous explosion in terms of growth through the ports, which we're already doing. And so we have other issues of going on now, of congestion and problems of moving goods out, because there's so much demand out there in the nation for goods that are coming from outside of the country, which is another issue, but I'm not going to deal with that. So the issue is dealing with how do we move forward in changing this fleet? How do we improve the public health, address environmental justice issues by reducing diesel emissions from this tremendously important as a thing? We're talking about, as I say, a major part of the U.S. economy. We're not going to stop this. We need to enhance it. So I want to ask first Mr. Allen or then anyone else on the panel, how do we move forward with heavy-duty vehicle electrification more quickly? I know we're moving. What is the research and investment that may be needed, if that's so? What are the kinds of federal support do you see as possibly to be a partner in this venture? Because I'm just focused on those heavy-duty trucks, those carrying 40-foot containers. We're talking about, and I'm not downgrading what the role of diesel has helped this nation. We wouldn't be where we are today without them.
Right. So
I want to know how do we move forward?
Sure, Congressman. I think help is on the way for you. I believe that with the right government funding here in just the next couple of years, there will be vehicles that can go 250 miles. They granted they're not over the road, but they can go 250 miles which will
But
take
these
a vehicle.
vehicles frequently are going a lot more than 250 miles, as we know. Not
Well,
like
the
Lexus, where they close after 350 miles or so that they say goodnight. These
Right.
are, yeah.
So that's the first one, but also there is help coming to terminal tractors that are used at the port, as well as the heavy-duty forklifts. We are working with companies like them today to help. But I believe the best thing that the federal government can do would be to expand the funding. So today there's the low no emissions vehicle program that's for transit vehicles. That should be expanded for areas of high emissions focus like the ports, to be able to incent both the manufacturers and the users to convert those vehicles quickly.
Representative Lowenthal, if I may, Rafael Santana, I think that's where one of the key roles that rail can play here, being the most sustainable way of moving freight overlands. And what we see here is the opportunity to actually accelerate decarbonization at the same time you increase the utilization in rail. And one of the things that we seek through the Freight 2030 vision is to also allow the creation standards of the information, so it allows you to understand how freight is coming into the ports and allowing a more really efficient way of moving tanks from point A to point B. And this has to solve not just for speed, but it has to solve for efficiency, but also for less carbon emission type of transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Santana. I agree with you, and I think the ports agree with you in the nation that role of rail is vitally important, getting more and more important. The major investments now in our ports are in rail infrastructure.
Thank you, Congressman.
But it's not just, there's got to be a kind of a multimodal approach, and I'm just concerned we're not going to get rid of trucks.
All right, thank you very much, Congressmember Lowenthal. We've got to move on.
I yield back. I yield back. Thank you.
Next up is Congressmember LaMalfa. Is Congressmember LaMalfa still on? Okay. How about Congressmember Carbajal?
Thank you. My question is to Ms. Giammona. We know the transportation sector is a large emitter of harmful greenhouse gas emissions, and sourcing for fossil fuels has led to significant environmental damage to our communities. I happen to represent the Central Coast of California, and in Santa Barbara County, our community has seen firsthand the devastation oil drilling inflicts to our environment and local economy. Not only did the 2015 Plains All-American oil spill harm wildlife in the region, it cost us over $90 million to clean up the area, not to mention the negative impact to our local economy. How does electrification of our transportation sector help protect our environment? And can you also walk us through the economic benefits and jobs associated with moving towards electric vehicles?
Congressman, thank you so much. Thank you for your question. You know, as I stated in my opening statements, our domestic produced clean energy is 88% GHG free. So, you know, we have really focused on, as we're, you know, using more renewables, really moving to cleaner technology to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As it relates to the economics of EVs, this has an opportunity to create many jobs and many jobs across the nation, both from an infrastructure standpoint, from a technology standpoint, and certainly at the vehicle level. So, you know, in California, what we've seen is a tremendous opportunity for growth of employment to support this new technology. And in particular, at PG&E, we've partnered very closely with the IBEW and ensured that we're using our, you know, great labor force that supports our current infrastructure to really support this new technology and growth within California.
Thank you very much. Mr. Allen, expanding access to electric vehicles also requires an expansion of our charging stations and hydrogen fueling infrastructure. HR 2, the Moving Forward Act, that I and my colleagues on this committee helped write under the leadership of Chairman DeFazio, included several provisions to build infrastructure for the 21st century that includes electric charging stations and hydrogen fueling infrastructure. In building out this infrastructure, how are we ensuring all Americans are benefiting from this, especially communities that have been traditionally left behind?
Thank you, Congressman. You know, as we got into the electric vehicle transit bus business over the past number of years, the biggest impediment for agencies to put more electric transit buses into service was the infrastructure. So we have focused our company on being able to provide charging and infrastructure solutions so that agencies can move forward faster. These charging stations are open source. So not just can they be used by a transit agency for their buses, but they could also be used for municipal fleet vehicles, and even depending on how they're located, could be used for the general public. And we believe that that is a big enabler to be able to provide charging and infrastructure in all communities, but especially ones that are typically not served by infrastructure.
Thank you. Mr. Konar, what is the importance of leveraging the private sector to achieve the electric vehicle charging goals that President Biden laid out? And how can companies like Pilot, Flying J, and other fuel retailers be part of the solution?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I would say the private sector has already invested a substantial amount of money. For example, if you look at Pilot, we have over $10 billion invested in creating an infrastructure where people currently fuel today. So leveraging that infrastructure gets you to the answer a lot faster than trying to replicate that infrastructure. So I think what the federal government should do, and I think will be helpful in reducing our carbon footprint, is allowing us to bridge our way from where the uptake of this technology is today. As I'd mentioned before, less than 1% usage on our interstate chargers, to a point where it's economically feasible to do it, but everything else works, right? We've got the locations, we've got the investment, we just got to offer them a different fuel. And we are fuel agnostic. We're a customer service company. So we need to make sure that our customers are getting the service they need so that they buy more of that fuel. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Next up will be Congressmember Malinowski.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for very, very interesting presentations. Let me just start by laying out the proposition that the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy is possibly the most significant predictable economic transformation the world has ever seen. It's something that should happen, in my view, but just as important, it is happening and it will happen. And therefore, it is in our economic interest as a country from a competitiveness standpoint to get ahead of it and to lead it. Let me maybe start with you, Mr. Allen. Is that general statement something you would agree with?
I absolutely agree that. I think that the policies of the government here are, is an important factor in shaping the carbon emissions reductions in this country.
You mentioned in your written testimony that there are just over 2,700 zero-emission transit buses on the road in the United States, but in China, you noted there are 450,000 EV buses. As I hope all of us know, China is by far the largest producer of solar and wind energy, holds 3/4 of the world's manufacturing capacity for lithium-ion battery cells. In 2013, we, the United States, had 5 times as many electrical vehicles as China. Today, China has twice as many as the United States. Why is this happening? Is it because the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party had a meeting and decided that they like trees more than jobs? Are they, all tree hugger Green New Deal? Is that what's going on? Or are they trying to win a race to the future?
I believe that, in my opinion, they're trying to win a race. I believe they have incentivized or they have driven this through a combination of incentives and mandates. And they want to be the world's largest producer of electric vehicle technology. And that's why we believe that we have the prime opportunity right now to incentivize the supply chain to be here in the United States through a combination of investments and domestic content requirements that can put the U.S. in the right place to lead and be not just sufficient for ourselves, but be an exporter of this technology.
Well, fantastic, and I'm glad that your company is leading the way in terms of manufacturing battery systems and other critical components of this in the United States. And thank you for encouraging us to do what we need to do to make sure the United States wins that race. That is my interest.
It's my goal also. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. In the same spirit, move to Mr. Smith as well. I'm very, very pleased to see that FedEx made this commitment to be carbon neutral by 2040. And when I meet with corporate executives back home, increasingly I find there's a recognition that we need market-driven policies to encourage that sort of change, including a growing recognition that putting a price on carbon is an efficient, market-driven way to bring down global emissions. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce just updated its position on climate change to include support for what it calls a market-based approach to accelerate reductions in emissions across the U.S. economy. The Business Roundtable has adopted a similar position. I just wanted to ask whether FedEx agrees and whether you believe we need to move nationally to a carbon pricing system.
Congressmember, I believe the representative of FedEx unfortunately had to leave the meeting early.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But
would anyone else be interested in taking that question then?
I can take a quick shot at it from I'm definitely not speaking for FedEx, but I believe a national carbon pricing system. I mean, it is a global problem. It's a national problem that we face. Would actually be helpful in kind of the provision of market-based incentives, which have worked in the renewable fuel standard. And I go back to that because that is a good blueprint on how this has worked before. Is something that we should think about in this respect.
Well, thank you. I'll say to you all, and I would certainly have said to FedEx if they were still here. It's very encouraging to hear corporate CEOs say that and to take those positions, just as it's encouraging to hear them say we should rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. I'm hopeful that our private sector, Chamber of Commerce in particular, will really make this a priority in terms of their advocacy on Capitol Hill. Because sometimes they say these things and they come to meet with us and it's not necessarily one of their top 3 issues, and that's got to change. We're going to make progress. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Next up will be the Vice Chair of the committee, Vice Chair Davids.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you to our panel of witnesses for taking time to join us today. I represent the Kansas 3rd Congressional District, which, thanks to its central location, is one of the busiest intermodal hubs in the country where rail, trucking, air cargo, maritime, and others meet. But because of our geographic location, we're right up against the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers. We also have the second largest federal levees, only behind New Orleans. The Weather Channel Climate Disruption Index has ranked Kansas City as the fifth of 25 cities to be most impacted by the effects of climate change in the coming years. Thanks in large part to the urban heat index effect, we're going to see 20 days per year above 90 degrees. That's as compared to our rural Kansas communities. And then we also have increased chances of drought in the coming years. And as storms and weather patterns become more severe, they're going to put a lot of stress on our transportation systems and public infrastructure. And I think that we've heard a lot about how we can address all of these things here today. And during the 2 years I've served on this committee, I've been fortunate to see the ways that the folks here today in your sectors are responding to this existential threat. And I think that we've seen that we're going to need a true partnership to tackle these. And I think I'm going to start with Mr. Lewis. Your testimony recognizes the benefits of using life cycle funding cost perspective in infrastructure investment, and that there are very limited tools is what you said. I was hoping you could expand on those tools and whether or not Congress can help increase the access to those tools.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, there are tools, actually. Unfortunately, there's not a single set of consensus tools and standards to be applied. So from a federal standpoint, there could be these guidelines that would commit to what an acceptable tool and an acceptable standard would need to include. Then you wouldn't have this problem of multiple different sources and organizations putting out their different performance metrics and approaches. The American Society of Civil Engineers is currently working on a standard for sustainable infrastructure that should come out at the end of this year, which will be an ANSI standard. That will help. There's a tool called Envision that the Institute on Sustainable Infrastructure has developed, and basically takes a life cycle approach that includes both sustainability and resilience. So it goes even beyond like what LEED does for buildings. This does it for all types of infrastructure. It really looks at not just how to build something sustainably in a resilient way, but also how you pick projects and how you prioritize which projects should get the funding, and even what locations are best for projects. So there are tools out there, but there needs to be incentives or extra points, if you will, in federal funding for projects that use these tools and employ them and score higher on, for example, the Envision rating system that's in existence. Because right now it's really just the honor system in terms of organizations wanting to use these tools.
Thank you. And I think that's a great segue to Mr. Rudd. I'd like to hear a little bit about the, you mentioned probability weight of cost and having cost models that rate probability cost as we start looking at projects. And I'm curious if you could maybe expand on that, and as we talk about what tools are available, how you envision that being used.
Certainly. And really this is building off what Mr. Lewis explained, which is when you're looking at the models that are used to ultimately determine or choose the projects that will be invested in terms of infrastructure, we typically look at what is the lowest cost model defined around a certain set of parameters for that infrastructure. And as Mr. Lewis pointed out, what we want to do is we want to actually change that scoring system. So in that procurement process, we're not simply looking at cost. We're also looking at the measurable outcomes of resiliency, the measurable impact on the environment or the emissions, the measurable impact on the community itself in terms of the health and safety of the community. So it's effectively expanding that scoring system to not just look at the lowest cost option. And included in that is also looking at innovation. There is a lot of times in these models, innovation is ignored. I'll give you an example. There was a large tollway project that was being evaluated. And in terms of noise reduction for the communities around it, they had to look at retaining walls to do that, a traditional way of insulating against noise. The alternative was to use low noise asphalt. It would have reduced the cost by 30% of the project, But ultimately, it was not within the bounds of the standards of that procurement. And so it was not part of any submission that was made. So it's really opening up the standards so that you can consider these other alternatives other than cost.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. And Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Mast. Brian, are you available?
Yep, thank,
Okay.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. Look, I think there's been a lot of ambitious talking today about electrification, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. Probably all of us as parents, if we're parents, none of us would encourage our kids to strive for anything other than something ambitious. That's hopefully what defines us as Americans, is that we look to be ambitious about the things that we do. But I want to ask some specific numbers because this relates to everybody. As we're looking at the source of electrification, which is having the power to, whether it be a UPS or a FedEx truck or some other delivery vehicle or somebody's home. And so the questions are going to be geared towards you, Ms. Giammona. As we look at some of those costs, obviously we can see variations in when we look at fuel costs based upon global geopolitics and what's going on. We can see fluctuations. But as we look around domestically, we also see various fluctuations in the cost for electricity, just domestically. And obviously, wind is better in some places, sun is better in other places, different forms, nuclear power in other places and other things. But can you speak to how do we work to ambitiously get our average cost per kilowatt hour down? What is the best form of electrification in some places that we're not looking at? Do we need to look at more nuclear, whereas you've seen the prices skyrocket in countries like Germany because of their move away from nuclear? I don't have a bend on that. I'm using that as an example. I look at some of the averages, and I'd be lying if I said I knew all of the inputs that the communist parties put into subsidizing their electricity costs. But Russia being an average of 6 cents per kilowatt hour, China listed as an average of 0.8, or rather 8 cents per kilowatt hour, US on the average of somewhere around 13, 14 cents per kilowatt hour, California being up in the 20s, Florida being down in around 10, 11 cents per kilowatt hour. How do we ambitiously get to being at 5, 6 cents a kilowatt hour?
Congressman, thank you for your question. You
can't, your internet's down. Can't hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Just start over again, Lori. We couldn't hear your answer to his question.
Okay.
Perhaps you need to shut off your video.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Congressman, thank
Well, are you muted? We heard her for a second. I think it's the internet, isn't it? Okay. We figured out what it is? Is it on her end, or is it the? Okay. Brian, why don't you try a question on someone else who has better connectivity, and let's see if it's the overall system or her connectivity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I'll yield back to you. Maybe if you could just agree to, when her internet gets back up, let her answer my question. It's really the crux of my question, since Mr. Smith has moved on as well. So maybe if you just make that agreement, I'd be happy to yield back.
Be happy to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Mace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I want to thank everyone, all of our witnesses this afternoon for
being on this panel and sticking around and spending much of your day and answering our questions. Being a freshman on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, I've learned a lot today and a lot leading up to the testimony. First, I want to thank Mr. Konar for his testimony, and pleased to learn that as an industry that you all have adapted and largely in response to tax incentives and utilizing those to sell lower carbon intensity alternatives to gasoline and diesel and being innovative. And we have many innovators who are on our panel today. And although this also echoes the comments we heard earlier today by Mr. Hernick, and who said that the federal policy playbook should first and foremost really harness the power of free markets. And you really were speaking my language. I want to turn to Mr. Allen, who's on here today, and I wanted to turn to you next. Really excited to see the innovation of Proterra and what you're doing, not only in the state of South Carolina. My understanding is that your company in Greenville, that your location there is expanding. You're looking to hire employees, particularly during a really challenging time for many businesses and industries. In my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina, we have 6 electric buses, and our goal is to have 32 by the year 2022. And I learned today that it's not just Tesla that's creating batteries for electric vehicles and battery technology, but Proterra also is being very innovative, and I appreciate and commend your leadership and your company's leadership on that technology. Oftentimes, the government, when we're looking to be innovative, can inhibit innovation through heavy-handed regulation and picking winners and losers through different types of programs or funding mechanisms. Are there some areas that you could talk to where the government could potentially get out of the way, or where we might be holding up growth and development for the industry going forward, so that we can create better next-gen technologies and a need for batteries for vehicles, buses, and the like?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. We have been in South Carolina, Greenville specifically, since 2010. We love being there. We love our workforce. They're just incredibly dedicated, hardworking people. And I enjoy spending my time there as much as I can also. And in addition, those are our buses with our battery technology that you're experiencing in Charleston right now. So we're very proud of that also. In terms of how we can work with the government, I would say from a manufacturing and development standpoint, the government doesn't get in the way of what we're trying to do. We have, a number of training programs in concert with government agencies and local community colleges to get our people trained, and we're very proud of the way that is. I think the biggest thing that could help to accelerate this industry really is on the demand side, as I've stated earlier, and have the government help agencies begin the transformation. There's about 400 transit agencies in North America today, and I believe less than 200 of those have their first electric vehicle. So I think it would be great for the government to continue to help agencies move towards electrification, and then again to incentivize domestic supply chain and provide incentives through the ATVM program that would apply to our industry would be great. And then the third would be support fleet electrification. And primarily this is on municipal fleets and the school bus transformation to electrification. I think those 3 areas the government supports today. And I think a continued focus there and acceleration would be wonderful for our country. Thank you.
Thank you. And my last question, because we only have about a minute left, really would go to anybody on the panel today, and learning more about electric vehicles across the board. Obviously, there's cart before the horse. To develop electric vehicles, you've got to then have charging stations all around. And there seems to be some disparity in terms of what it costs maybe to put an electric charging station in a residence, like at somebody's home, in your driveway or in your garage, versus maybe at a C-store or a gas station or a restaurant or some other commercial location. I don't know if there's anyone with the few moments we have left that could kind of talk to that a little bit for those who might be watching.
Congresswoman Mays, if I may answer that at least a little bit, there is a substantial difference between charging inside communities as opposed to charging on the highway. When you have time, the cost of the charging stations, which are level 2 chargers, is not very much. But when you're looking to charge things in 20, 30, 40 minutes, then the cost and the infrastructure needs expand substantially. So, you know, and it could be as much as 10 plus times when you're putting in these DC fast chargers. So that's just to give you a little bit of perspective, but we're happy to follow up with that later if you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We believe that Ms. Giammona is back online and could now answer Representative Mast's question. Ms. Giammona?
I'm listening.
Yeah, I know. We're waiting. We were told she was back online.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes. That's all we ever get, though. She says that, and then it goes down. Okay. Sorry. We'll try again in a minute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you say that every time, and then it goes away. So keep talking.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for the question. We believe that rates determined by commissions are really what are going to help the issue of affordability. We're collaborating with our commission in California, focusing on addressing affordability overall. And specifically, we believe that EVs coupled with time of use rates present opportunities to bring down rates overall by getting more throughput during times where there's excess capacity on the grid.
Okay. Brian, you have a little more time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ma'am, if you could just expand a little bit on rates determined by a commission. Are you looking at both price floors and price ceilings? As we're all probably familiar with what we see on electric bills for high usage surcharges, is there going to be an increase in seeing that you're not necessarily accounting for if you have to now account for, you know, putting however many kilowatt hours into charging multiple vehicles of a home? Just maybe elaborate a little bit on that for us.
Sure.
I'd appreciate it.
Thanks for the question. California is moving to time of use rates for all residential customers. We have had high use rate charges. We're starting to level those out. But the combination of time of use rates, not just for your general residential customer, but also for businesses, as well as programmatically for EV charging, allow us to flatten out grid usage, allow us to flatten out consumption, and which ultimately will bring rates down overall in the state.
And if I have one more second, let me just ask this pointedly. Can we get to a US average of 8 cents per kilowatt hour, 6 cents per kilowatt hour? Can you get us there? Or I know there are many out there that do electricity, but let's hear your opinion.
Well, you know, as you noted in California, we're much higher than that, but it would be our hope. Our focus, along with our state commissions and our regulators and our policymakers, is really focused on reducing rates overall in California. But like we heard from the congressman from South Dakota, rate structures are different and fuel mix is different across the country. So I think it's really a state by state opportunity, if you will.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Lamb. Connor. Okay. To vote two. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Bordeaux. Mr. Desaunier. Okay, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses for sticking it out with us. It's been a long hearing, some interruptions, but we appreciate you all very much for your testimony. Mr. Lewis, in your written testimony, you highlight the importance of incorporating equity into our climate and transit solutions. A solution to climate change is inextricably linked to the idea of transit. It's hard to separate the two, as lower income communities and communities of color seek environmental justice and transit justice. Like the disparities laid bare by the effects of COVID-19 on health, death, and economic outcomes on people of color, the climate crisis disproportionately impacts people of color. What is your opinion on the issue of climate solutions being race conscious?
Yeah, I think absolutely there is a connection. It's been shown, whether it be COVID or it be other urban challenges in particular, that there is a disparate impact on the more disadvantaged communities, which tend to be populated by people of color. These are also communities that tend to have more industrialization around them, happen to be usually more in the flood-prone areas, closer to the waterfronts and coastal. So that there are several factors that all work against these highly vulnerable communities. And so that's why when I talked in my testimony about meeting these communities where they are, you need to understand what they're dealing with, their physical issues, their environmental issues, their social issues. You need to reckon with the past that they've had to deal with, their realities, before you can get their buy-in on the solutions, whether they be transit solutions or they be other solutions like distributed energy, solar in their neighborhoods, things like that. So you can understand how they're viewing things and then work their ideas and their perspectives into your solutions. But transit is a great example, especially in urban environments, of a way you can do that and get better mobility for these communities, which gives them more opportunity, gives them more access to jobs, and is a virtuous cycle.
Thank you. Ms. Giammona, in your testimony, you discussed the integration of climate science into your company's practices and functions. Please elaborate on how PG&E is responding to the climate crisis. Ms. Giammona? Well, I'll tell you, okay, go ahead, Ms. Giammona. Well, let me move to Mr. Santana. Mr. Santana, last week, the rail subcommittee discussed the climate solutions that a robust freight rail network presents to us. What commitments are your companies making to ensure that worker protections are central to climate goals?
So we're very committed. We invest about $200 million every year into solutions. They're very much focused along the lines of fuel efficiency and carbon reduction. In addition to that, we look at ways to drive more utilization of rail, as this is the most sustainable way of moving freight along the way. And when we think about the Freight 2030 vision, this will greatly enable really a further growth in rail, and that would help with all the goals you just mentioned.
Yeah, there are many energy sector jobs that are not considered worker friendly, and that's the reason why I asked you that question. Any particular thing that your companies are doing to create worker protections that are in keeping with other industries?
Absolutely. And last year, we issued our sustainability report as a company, where we make a commitment directly to, well, reduce emissions ourselves, reduce water usage, but at the same time, a commitment to make sure that we're helping the communities that we operate in, and really offering jobs and opportunities here, whether it's for minorities, people of color, and female representation. This is very much part of the framework we have, and we have specific goals that we are committed to meet.
Thank you, and my time is expired, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Westerman.
It's not coming on, Mr. Chair. Oh, I guess it is. The light's not working. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimonies today. Mr. Smith mentioned that FedEx's investment in the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture, which partners with the Yale School of Environment, where I attended long ago. From the front page of the center's website, it states that emissions reductions are crucial, but alone are not enough. I couldn't agree more, and that's why I've proposed proactive natural solutions like the Trillion Trees Act that would restore our forests, promote reforestation, promote innovation, and promote market-based solutions for wood products. Mass timber construction is a relatively new innovation that has many environmental benefits and benefits for rural economies. In my home state of Arkansas, the University of Arkansas has constructed the country's largest mass timber project with 2 5-story dormitories. That project is soon to be dwarfed by Walmart's new 15,000 employee corporate headquarters that will also be constructed with mass timbers. Yale School of the Environment researchers recently published a paper in the journal Nature Sustainability titled Buildings as a Global Carbon Sink, and I ask unanimous consent to submit that to the record, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. We know that forests are the largest scale, most efficient system to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and wood products like we see here on this dais are 40 to 50% by weight stored carbon. Except for in some western states where we're burning up forests faster than we're growing them, U.S. forests are continuing to add carbon storage volume each year. From the Yale study, the authors stated that mass timber construction has potential to create a vast bank vault that could store up to 68 million tons of carbon annually. They added that a city using mass timber construction would become a carbon sink versus a carbon source. They also concluded the overwhelming climate benefit of mass timber is something that every city planner should consider. Mr. Rudd, I know your company is a large global company, and I've seen on your websites that you've done some work with mass timbers. I have 2 questions. The first one is, what are the barriers for more mass timber construction in buildings?
Thank you for the question. First of all, most of the projects that we're involved with are driven by the desires and the economic benefits to our customers and to our clients. So first of all, today, when we look at again, I'm repeating this, the models that are used to evaluate these types of projects, it is focused on cost. It is not focused on elements beyond simply the cost of the project. So for example, like promoting the investment in timber construction, which effectively is creating a carbon sink, promoting decarbonization of our environments. So again, my suggestion again is when we look at these types of projects, some encouragement in terms of the legislation to promote thinking beyond just simply the lowest cost model of construction would allow us to move in the direction of promoting timber construction, large timber construction, and promoting the creation and investment in carbon sinks.
Are you facing any regulations or building codes that prohibit using mass timber construction?
I'll have to have somebody research that and get back to you with the question. I don't know the answer to that question.
The U.S. Forest Service Lab has also done studies that show that using mass timbers in bridge construction can produce structures that last up to 50 years. What do you think about engineering firms, architecture firms using mass timber in rural bridge construction?
Well, again, when we look at our projects around the world, we see a combination of mass timber construction, steel bridge construction, and concrete bridge construction. As far as I can tell, there is no regulation that is preventing the adoption of it. I think we have to change that direction and look at not mandates, but look at ways of encouraging use towards mass timber construction.
And with what little time I've got, Mr. Chairman, I'll just add a plug that we've got to produce more of our rare earth minerals here in the United States to fuel our green economy. Now you'll back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Under your leadership, this committee will soon take up a transformative infrastructure investment bill. I can't wait. And it is so important that we make the case that this hearing is making, that when we make that investment, not only will it do right by the American economy and job creation and pay for itself many times over, but it's also going to help, when we do it right, reestablish American leadership on the issue of climate change. So thank you for hosting this important hearing. I know that as a former mayor of one of the largest cities in America, that when we made smart investments in fighting climate change and climate adaptation, it helped the city's bottom line. It certainly helped when the various credit rating agencies, the bond agencies, would rate the city of Phoenix, which had the highest bond rating of any of the largest cities in America. The fact that we made smart investments to fight climate change at the municipal level was an advantage. Arizona, of course, is getting hit harder, as hard or even harder than almost any other state in the country with extreme heat and the drought conditions that we're facing, as well as forest fires. So these investments are important and they're very real to our community. On the private sector side, by the way, corporations, publicly traded corporations, are being judged whether or not they are making the right investments in their future in fighting climate change. So at the global level, at the national level, at the state level, on the private level, this is really good for business. Mr. Allen, my question is for you. Your testimony states that the federal surface transportation policy supporting the development of alternative fuel technologies and investments in zero-emission vehicles can help ensure the United States becomes the global leader that it should be in research, development, and manufacturing of electric vehicles. So I want you to elaborate a little bit more on that, and what can this committee, this important committee, do to help ensure that the U.S. competitiveness stays in the global electric vehicle market?
Thank you, sir, for the question. I think the biggest area that this committee can help with, and the biggest thing that we can do in the United States, is support domestic supply chain. Today, the cells that all of us use, come from a foreign country. Many of them, China, Korea, Japan. There's no reason with the increasing demand in the United States that we can't have cell manufacturing here in the United States. And in partnership with the companies that are currently making them, this will help mining in North America. This will reduce supply chain costs, overall costs. It'll create phenomenal manufacturing jobs in the United States. So I encourage this committee, through both incentives and Buy America requirements, to move forward and help the supply chain make these investments in North America. As the gentleman from Flying J Pilot has said, it's very difficult for companies to do this because a little bit of the chicken and the egg. So to have government get out ahead and help these companies when volumes are low, to be able to provide the opportunity to scale up, is really an important factor that I think can be a great public partner or public-private partnership going forward.
Thank you so much for that answer. As Chair, I have some additional questions. I'll submit them for the record in the interest of time, and I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Lamb. Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
What?
Thank you, Mr.
What?
Chairman.
What?
And
sorry,
I
wait
wanted
a minute. It was a Republican turn. Mr. Guest.
I was.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To all of our distinguished panel, I want to thank you for being with us today. I want to start off, Mr. Hernick, in reading your testimony that you provided to the committee on page 2. You talk about Congress will need to reduce or eliminate barriers to infrastructure development. It should take 2 years, not 10, to permit infrastructure projects. Red tape is not the price of good government, it is the enemy of good government. America should modernize its infrastructure, reduce costs while dramatically enhancing environmental benefits with a 2-year approval process for large construction projects. You go on to say that polling shows a significant percentage, roughly 73%, support streamlining and reforming government regulations. I know that this is something that I hear about routinely when I'm back home in the district meeting with governmental officials. And I would just ask you if you could please just expand on that for just a few moments.
Yeah, absolutely, Congressman. I appreciate the opportunity to go into a little more detail. The truth is that what Americans want from their government is responsiveness. They're interested in seeing private sector solutions to meet their needs on a daily basis. And there's a role for government to safeguard the environment, safeguard the people working on projects, and to safeguard, national monuments and the things that make this country great. But really, Americans are looking for a firm thumbs up or thumbs down on whether or not a project or a business can proceed at pace. And when we're talking about creating jobs, when we're talking about the economic transformation and benefits that we're going to see from moving to a cleaner and cleaner grid and moving to a cleaner and cleaner national transportation infrastructure, we want to make sure that that can be done on a timely basis. And I think that the FAST 41, the FAST Act, was demonstrated that these types of projects can be done upholding all of the social and environmental safeguards that we need. That if we hold government bureaucrats accountable to a timeline, the same way that the private sector is, the same way that I am as an employee, and that if we hold government to those same standards, government can perform on a timeline. And I think that's not too much to ask.
And you go on page 8 and you talk about the fact that there is another cost-efficient way to significantly reduce emissions in the vehicle fleet. And you talk about switching to low-emission fuels such as natural gas or propane. And I've also had the opportunity when I'm home in the district visiting some of my propane suppliers to talk about or to hear about the benefits of propane vehicles, whether it be automobiles, forklifts, riding lawnmowers, normally vehicles which would burn either gas or diesel being converted to natural gas or propane. You talk about cost savings, emission reduction, and energy security. Again, could you just expand on that very briefly about the benefits of vehicles which would use natural gas or propane instead of gasoline or diesel?
Absolutely. The bottom line, Congressman, is that we need an all-of-the-above approach. Mr. Allen spoke about the price point for electric school buses being there now, but there's still an upfront cost. And some school districts, some municipalities just don't have the cash on hand, especially in these tough economic times, to make those kinds of investments. It's going to be more appropriate to switch to propane in some cases. And, for moms and kids and dads standing at the bus stop, those types of air quality emissions benefits that we can see within the next year or two, well, that matters a lot more than waiting for a complete transition to electric vehicles. And that's not to say that electric vehicles aren't a part of the future. They certainly are. But I think that what we want is, from government, an all-of-the-above approach to be able to allow states and municipalities to utilize the most locally appropriate approach.
And would you agree that we currently have the technology, the ability, and many of our vehicles to go ahead and transition them over right now to propane or natural gas?
It's happening right now. I live in Maryland, and it's one where Governor Hogan has taken the issue very seriously. He wants to reduce emissions. And so it's been great to see his administration be able to make those switches and make that investment. They're improving air quality and reducing emissions in a very cost-effective way, and I think that's something that the federal government can look at too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start out by just emphasizing the great local support that Wabtec's Freight 2030 vision has already obtained in Pittsburgh And if I could ask unanimous consent to insert 2 letters into the record from the Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce and the Allegheny County Executive regarding the Freight 2030 vision.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This vision really builds on what in Western Pennsylvania has been a successful model of collaboration between our universities, in particular Carnegie Mellon, and these great heritage companies like that we have, like Wabtec, which is related to the original Westinghouse set of endeavors, that has given us things over the years like nuclear energy and a number of defense technologies and important technologies for freight and rail. And this is really the next generation. And so, Mr. Santana, hoping that you're still on here remotely, I was hoping that you could go into a little bit more detail for the committee about the sort of public-private balance of the project that you guys are proposing here. Our understanding is you already have a locomotive running on a battery, essentially, out in some very harsh terrain out in California. But there are further leaps that need to be made, further scientific leaps, in particular, bringing hydrogen into the equation and all of the manufacturing and engineering that would go into actually making those fuel cells for the future. If you could talk a little bit about how that demand for further research and knowledge would be met in a mix of investment by your company privately, a university like Carnegie Mellon, and the federal government as well.
Representative Lamb, we're seeking here approval for this public-private partnership so we can really bring and start working with the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, and making sure that we ultimately really executing on the vision we laid out, which starts with decarbonization. There's significant steps here that would evolve with the next generation of battery electric locomotives, but getting to fuel cells and getting to hydrogen. It's a roadmap that provides, I think, critical milestones to continue to decarbonize solutions for rail. At the same time, it de-risks as we go there. On the other front, we have the opportunity here to increase rail utilization. This partnership with CMU, we bring the best of the country and certainly the best of Pittsburgh when it comes to both artificial intelligence and robotics. This is about really creating more efficiency as you move things from point A to point B, which ultimately translates to a more competitive logistics for the country. And it comes down to creating standards. It comes down into really connecting a multitude of stakeholders to this process. And
thank you. And I think the competitiveness, if I could, just get in before we run out of time. I think the competitiveness point is a key one. Because we are not the only ones in the world who are interested in improving our freight and logistics, and we certainly are not the only ones in the world who are interested in hydrogen. Europe and China have both already openly published national hydrogen strategies. This is a new technology that they intend to dominate and not allow the United States to be the world leader in the way that we were world leaders in oil exploration and natural gas exploration and nuclear energy and all the rest. And so for those considering what is the role of public investment in public and private partnerships like this, one important role is simply to win the race, to speed up the pace of our developments and advancements, because we are going against state-backed enterprises from China and similar dynamics from the EU as well. So I think your proposal is a great one. I hope that the committee can continue to work with Wabtec and CMU and all of those interested in this. Not just for the good of Western Pennsylvania, which is very close to my heart, but I think it is part of our overall national transportation and competitiveness strategy. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman. 2 questions for Mr. Henrik. And I'll ask both of them and I'll allow you to respond. The federal government just spent close to $7 trillion over the last year in response to the pandemic. My first question is, how do you think Congress should pay for the country's much needed infrastructure going forward? What revenue mechanism? And second, you had mentioned Fast 41 in your opening testimony. It is viewed as a tremendously successful model for ensuring infrastructure projects stay on track. So I was just wondering secondarily if you could outline some of the successes from this program and explain why you think this bipartisan initiative should be extended.
Well, thank you for your questions, Congressman Fitzpatrick. As for well, there's been a lot of stimulus and a lot of money that Congress has passed just recently. I do want to underscore that 34 billion of that was for clean energy as a part of the Energy Act of 2020. And I do want to thank again the members who voted in a bipartisan manner to support that Energy Act of 2020. It included very important price signals for the market in terms of tax incentives, and also included important updates for the Department of Energy in particular to be able to get us to that next generation of clean energy. I think that's important to underline that we've already done a lot. And I think that it's important to see how that affects the economy. I mentioned earlier that I have 4 daughters. In terms of how to pay, I'd rather that we figure out how the folks on this screen here can pay for any additional spending in transportation and infrastructure, and not those girls. I think it's important to be able to look at a balanced budget approach and make sure that we're not overdoing it. There's a lot of stimulus in the pipeline. There's no shortage of private sector capital that is aimed at clean energy. Very specifically, some of the biggest investors on Wall Street have climate considerations that they're putting in on a voluntary basis to help guide their funding towards clean energy. So if you've got a clean energy project and it can pencil out, you've got an investor. There's no question about that. In terms of Fast 41, I think that it's also important to note that there are the types of projects that we need to make this transition to a clean transportation and a clean energy future in there. Wind power on public land, and then a couple of different transmission lines that are going to be needed to assure that we have the reliability built into our grid to diversify, maintain an all of the above approach to generating power, and then assure that folks can keep the lights on no matter what Mother Nature brings or has in store for us. So there's a major opportunity to reauthorize Fast 41. That's kind of a first step in my mind. I think that looking to one federal decision and codifying that as well would be a second and also beneficial step.
Thank you, Mr. Henrik, and thank you, to your organization for being very objective, very policy focused, working in a bipartisan manner. There is a huge need out there. You guys do a really good job, and working with Democrats and Republicans to advance responsible solutions. So I thank you for that, sir. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Garcia. What? All right. Well, I want to thank our witnesses for hanging in through a long hearing. I appreciate all your contributions to this topic, and you've proved to be a valuable resource. So since there are no further questions from the committee, I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such a time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearings without objection. So ordered. The committee stands adjourned. Yeah.